I awoke in a standing position, my eyes suddenly shooting open and my legs weakening as I began to stumble. I panicked as I felt myself falling forward, instinctively reaching out to grab the nearest thing, which happened to be the shirt of a guy standing in front of me.
"Watch it, buddy!"
He exclaimed in annoyance, although the mystery man did take hold of my arm and shoulder before helping me to steady myself.
"Are you okay?"
He asked sympathetically. "Yeah, I think so," I replied through trembling lips as I tried to get my bearings.
"Well, just keep your cool. And whatever you do, don't step over the white lines."
I didn't understand what he meant, but then I adjusted my eyes and surveyed the scene around me. I hadn't seen the face of the man who'd helped me, but when I looked up, I could make out the back of his head in the darkness, and I realized he'd turned around after assisting me, now facing forwards. Darkness was all around me, but there was a dim illumination on the ground which I stood upon. Two lines of white light about 3 feet apart, one to the left of me and the other on my right. I remembered what the man had told me a moment earlier, warning me to not step outside these lines. I didn't know what he meant, but somehow realized this was probably good advice. I creaked my head to one side, looking over the shoulder of the man ahead and seeing a line of people standing in front of him, a long, single-file line of shadowy figures stretching for several hundred yards up what appeared to be a slight elevation. All stood within the 2 white lines, which seemed to operate like some kind of emergency lighting, and at the top of the line of unidentified figures was a doorway of bright, almost blinding light, a literal beacon in a sea of darkness, inviting, comforting, and offering a glimmer of hope in what otherwise seemed like a dangerous situation. I didn't understand what this place was or why I was here, but in that moment, I believed the shining white light ahead was my salvation. There were dozens, maybe hundreds of people standing in the line in front of me, and I couldn't move past them without stepping outside the white lines. I shook my head, experiencing an almost crippling anxiety as my mind raced to make sense of this inexplicable situation. I opened my dry lips and struggled to speak, addressing my fearful question to the anonymous man in front of me. What is this place? How did we get here?" He didn't turn his head to face me, but the man did respond.
"You see the white light at the front of the line?"
He asked in a surprisingly calm voice. "Yes?"
"Well, look behind you."
I was terrified but needed to know the truth, so I turned my head, making sure to keep my footing and stay within the lines as I did so. Directly behind me stood a woman about 5 feet 5 inches tall. I could barely make out her features in the dark, but in any case, her head was down, and it appeared she was unconscious. She was sleeping while standing up, just as I had been only moments before. I guessed this was the same for every person in the line, and that we'd all been unconscious when they brought us here. But who had done this to us, and why? I decided this was a question for later. I suppose I should have paid more attention to the sleeping woman behind me, and if I'd done so, I would have surely recognized the young lady. But my attention was drawn to the scene beyond her. I soon realized I was standing in the middle of a long line which stretched back for at least several hundred yards and sloped downwards. And at its end was the polar opposite to the light before me. At the very bottom of the line was a swirling vortex of crimson red, a terrifying portal to God knows where, so vile and sinister that I couldn't bear to look upon it for more than a few seconds. If the light before us offered hope and salvation, the blood-red whirlpool surely represented doom and despair, and the mere sight of it chilled me to my very bones. I turned back around, muttering a profanity under my breath as my body shook.
"It gets worse,"
the man in front of me said ominously.
"Look ahead."
I creaked my head once again and saw a terrifying scene unfolding. I guess another man had suddenly woken up like I had, but he didn't react well to his surroundings. I watched in awestruck horror as the darkened figure stumbled, swearing as he put his foot forward and stepped outside of the white lines. Someone else in the line tried to stop him, reaching out to grab the disoriented man while shouting, but the well-meaning person's efforts were in vain as the man he was trying to save ignored the warning, slapping his hand away while shouting,
"Get away from me, you damn freak!"
And then he put both feet across the line on his right-hand side and walked out into the darkness. I say dark, but I could still make out his shape once he was over the line. He was a big guy, over 6 feet in height and well built. I guess he didn't scare easy and thought he could find a way out, but he didn't get far. I guess he was about 10 yards out before they got him. Thankfully, I couldn't see much in the dim light, and it all happened so fast. But the creatures that emerged from the black void were horrifying, imp-like demons the size of grown men, with eyes which burnt a deadly shade of red, and with claws and teeth like those of the deadliest predators. There were 3 monsters in total, moving so rapidly as they surrounded the doomed man and tore at him with their long and sharp claws. Their victim screamed in absolute terror as the monsters ripped his clothes and skin. Next, the horrified man tried to fight and make his way back to the relative safety of the line, but soon he was knocked over and seriously wounded by a deep slash along his back. Even then, he didn't give in, crawling along the hard ground as he desperately cried for help. Not one person attempted to reach him, however, as all remained frozen to their spots. And of course, he didn't make it. A moment later, one of the demons grabbed him by the legs, pulling his body away from the line as he screamed and tried in vain to dig his nails into the ground. Before long, the monsters and their victim disappeared into the darkness. Then I heard the appalling sounds of skin ripping, bones cracking, and finally what I can only assume was the noise of the monsters feasting on his still warm flesh. I retched, feeling like I was going to be sick, but nothing came up. Panic soon spread along the entire line as people reacted to the vicious killing we'd all just witnessed. Some deteriorated into screaming hysterics, whilst others fell into themselves, whimpering or quietly praying under their breath. But we were all in agreement on one point: we must not step outside of the white lines. Stepping out of the line meant certain death. While within the lines we were safe, for now at least. I shivered as I tried to come to terms with the extreme violence I'd just seen. It seemed like the temperature had suddenly dropped, or perhaps this was just my brain's perception. In any event, my mind was now racing, and I wanted to ask 100 questions at once. I noticed how the man in front of me had hardly reacted to the savage attack. It was like he'd expected it to happen. I also recalled how he'd helped me when I first woke up, but I was yet to see his face, and even now he would not turn around. He'd been the one who'd warned me about the rules, and that simple advice was probably what saved my life. Nevertheless, I had the distinct feeling that this faceless man knew more about our situation than he'd shared thus far, and so I was determined to ask him further questions. But before I got the chance, I was disturbed by a soft cry from behind me. I jumped in shock and turned around, almost accidentally putting my right foot over the line before I stopped myself. Once I'd turned, I saw the woman behind me slowly falling, and I reached out to catch her, taking hold of her slender body and helping her back up to her feet. I felt a familiarity as I held her in my arms. Perhaps it was her scent, or maybe my muscle memory. But then she lifted her head and met my eye, and I almost jumped out of my skin once I saw her face. "Sally?" I said in astonishment, as if my eyes were deceiving me.
"Joshua?"
She answered weakly, as she opened her eyes and slowly adjusted to our new environment. I saw her dark hair tied back in a bun, her soft skin and aggressive green eyes, and I knew it was indeed her. And Sally's presence in this hellish realm brought the terror I felt to a whole new level. I held on to Sally's body as she regained her composure, and continued to do so until she was able to stand on her own 2 feet. And I was still thinking of what to say as I looked into her frightened eyes, and a flood of old emotions came back to me. Some good, others bad. In the end, I could only repeat the crucial advice I'd been given, saying, "Don't step outside of the lines, Sally. Whatever you do, stay inside the lines." Sally looked up at me in confusion, and I was prepared for a stream of follow-up questions, which I likely couldn't answer. But before we got a chance to speak, the man in front of me spoke, asking,
Did the two of you know each other?
Yeah, I answered without thinking. Sally and I used to date.
Interesting.
The man replied without elaborating. He was still facing forward, and so couldn't have seen Sally falling into my arms. He must have been reacting to the sound of our voices and eavesdropping on our conversation. Meanwhile, Sally adjusted to our terrifying situation, looking ahead at the light and back towards the vortex. Her reaction was much the same as mine, and I saw her face contort with horror and confusion.
"Where are we?"
She asked, looking to me for answers. That's what I'm trying to find out, I replied, before turning back towards the man in front. Hey, buddy, you know our names. How about you tell us yours? The man still refused to turn his head and didn't speak for a long time, but he finally did answer my question, saying,
You can call me Milo.
Okay, I replied hesitantly. The name rang a bell somewhere in the back of my mind, but I didn't dwell on it. Well, Milo, how about you tell us what's going on?
What makes you think I know anything?
I think you know more than you're letting on. You told me about the lines after all.
Fair enough. I know some things, but not everything.
He paused before continuing.
You wake up in this queue, standing between the white lines. You know what happens when you step outside of them?
Sally didn't. Not yet, anyway. I was grateful she'd been spared the sight of the savage killing. What are those things out there? I asked, although a part of me didn't want to know the answer. Milo shrugged his shoulders, but still didn't turn around.
Can't say for sure. They could be demons, monsters, aliens, or genetic mutations. In the end, it doesn't really matter, does it? I know they dwell in the darkness all around us and they see everything. For whatever reason, they can't step inside of the lines. We're safe from them as long as we stay in the queue. But if we enter their domain, well, they'll slaughter us without hesitation.
I turned to Sally, seeing the fear in her eyes. That's a look I hadn't seen in a long time and hoped I would never witness again. I put a hand around her shoulder to comfort her, but she pushed me away, and I was forced to remember why we'd broke up in the first place. I put this to the back of my mind, however, instead focusing on my inquisition of the faceless man in front. So, we're trapped here? I asked fearfully, the desperation now evident in my voice.
Oh, no.
Milo answered in an almost flippant tone.
I'm afraid you don't understand. The queue won't remain stationary. When the trumpets blow, we move forward, one at a time.
When the trumpets blow? What did that mean? I thought about it for a moment before I realized the implications of what Milo was saying. You mean we move towards the light? I asked hopefully. I knew little about our situation, but surely the white light at the top of the line was our chance at salvation.
Yeah, that's what happens. But there's a catch.
What do you mean? I demanded in angry frustration.
You'll find out soon enough,
was Milo's typically evasive response. I opened my mouth to speak again, but then I heard it. The trumpets, blaring from God knows where, a deafening and terrifying sound which blasted out from the darkness, seemingly surrounding us on all sides. Both Sally and I collapsed down to our knees, covering our ears in a futile effort to drown out the awful din. I felt the pressure building inside of my skull and thought my head was going to explode, but thankfully, the trumpet stopped after a few moments, and then the line started to move. I looked forward and saw the figure at the front of the line stepping into the light. His dark silhouette immersed as he raised his arms and cried out in glorious ecstasy, gladly allowing the portal to transport him to another realm. And with that, he was gone, freed from this nightmare, and surely now safe from the monsters that dwelt within this dark hellscape. Wow, I expressed in amazement, but, like Milo had warned us, there was a catch. Suddenly, we heard a blood-curdling scream from behind us, a cry of abject terror emitted by someone in mortal danger. I swiftly turned my neck, seeing how Sally was already facing in that direction. My eyes widened in terror as I saw the man at the back of the line, his body being physically sucked into the swirling vortex of crimson red. He continued to scream as his legs were pulled inside, and soon he was up to his waist, reaching out desperately and digging his nails into the frozen dirt beneath us. There was a woman ahead of him in the line, and to her credit, she did try to help. Reaching down, she grabbed his hand tightly, but the pull of the vortex was too great. Within minutes, she lost her grip upon him, and the man was sucked through the portal. I remember the look on his face the second before he disappeared into the abyss, his eyes so wide and his mouth frozen in a silent scream, and then he was gone. The middle-aged woman who had tried to save him suddenly cried out, as something inside her just broke.
I can't do this! I can't be here!
And before anybody got a chance to stop her, the frightened woman did the worst thing imaginable. She stepped over the white line. There was nothing we could do but watch as the poor woman attempted to run into the darkness. Inevitably, she didn't make it far. The attack didn't play out like the previous time. She wasn't set upon by a gang of savage monsters, but instead confronted by a single creature which suddenly emerged from the black abyss to block her path. The woman froze, stopping dead in her tracks as she stared into the monster's burning red eyes. She was suddenly unable to flee or fight, as if the beast had her under its terrible spell. My jaw dropped as I observed the unreal scene. For a moment, I naively thought she might be okay, and that the monster would actually let her live. But then, in a single rapid and brutal attack, the beast raised its muscular arm and thrashed out with its claw, easily cutting the woman's jugular wide open. She grabbed at her throat as blood poured from the gaping wound and soon collapsed heavily to the floor. Her body continued to thrash as she choked on her own blood, but a moment later, the beast leaned down and grabbed hold of her hair, dragging the slowly dying woman into the darkness.
Oh my God.
Sally cursed under her breath, and I couldn't utter a word. This was the second person I'd seen slaughtered by the monsters stalking the shadows, but it didn't get any easier. Frightened murmurs and the occasional scream went along the line as all present reacted to what we'd just witnessed. Those who hadn't seen the deaths firsthand no doubt heard about them from their neighbors in the line, and the panic spread like wildfire. Still, I noted how Milo had not reacted to all of the bloodshed. I reckoned he must have eyes on the back of his head, and perhaps he'd seen it all before. Nevertheless, our mysterious companion was able to provide an explanation of sorts.
That's the catch I was telling you about. They let one person pass into the light whenever the trumpets sound, but there's a price to pay. One goes into the light, and the vortex takes one from the back of the line. That's the way it works.
Suddenly, I felt cold all over. I was sure the temperature had dropped since I first regained consciousness, although this was the least of my worries, as my exhausted brain attempted to process what Milo had just told us. I'm sure Sally was doing the same, as she remained silent for the time being, although I could hear her clicking her tongue, a habit she did when nervous or stressed. I glanced ahead and behind me, once again confirming that we stood roughly in the middle of the long, single-file line of people. If what Milo said was correct, one person would reach salvation at each trumpet blow, while one would simultaneously be sucked into oblivion or whatever lay on the far side of that portal. Assuming this twisted process continued, the line would gradually grow shorter as more people left this Shadowland. And in the end, we too would discover our fate. I felt a vile sickness in the pit of my stomach as my whole body shook. I didn't know what to say next, but it was Sally who broke the silence.
Hey Milo, that's your name, right?
She shouted over my shoulder. I saw Milo nodding in confirmation, but he still wouldn't turn to face us.
You know, you still haven't answered Joshua's question. You didn't tell us where we are and why we're here.
Like I said, I don't know everything. But I guess I've been conscious to our situation for longer than the two of you. During that time, I've come up with a couple theories.
Like what?
I could tell she was becoming increasingly impatient. We'd been split up for 2 years at this point, and hadn't spoken in nearly as long. But seeing her again in this dangerous and terrifying situation made me realize I still had feelings for her. Milo eventually replied in a matter-of-fact tone, with no emotion evident in his voice as he spoke.
Well, one possibility is that we've been kidnapped or abducted by some malicious person or persons. What's the last thing you remember before waking up here?
I tried to think, realizing there was an unexplained gap in my memory. I remember driving, I said uncertainly, and then everything went black. This didn't make sense. Had I been in an accident? If so, why didn't I recall a crash or collision?
I have the same memory.
Sally muttered nervously. I glanced back at her in confusion, only to find she wouldn't meet my eye. This revelation confused me even more. Sally and I hadn't been together. We hadn't even seen each other in 2 years. What were the odds of both of us being involved in car accidents at the same time? And all this talk reminded me of the incident which had led to our breakup in the first place. I'm sure Sally was thinking the same thing. We'd both promised to never speak of that night again.
So, if we were abducted, then who has us? And why are they doing this to us?
That's the million-dollar question. It could be aliens, I reckon. Or maybe it's the government running a psychological experiment. Or some sick billionaire who tortures people for fun. But of course, there is another possibility. one which is more supernatural in origin.
I stared at the back of Milo's head in astonishment, irritated that I couldn't see his face and tell whether he was serious or not. There was a tense pause while I waited for Milo to elaborate, but to my surprise, it was Sally who spoke next.
You mean that we're dead? That every person in the line is deceased and trapped between heaven and hell?
Her chilling words hung in the air as we considered the terrifying inference.
It's a possibility that's occurred to me.
Milo responded dispassionately, breathing life into the horrific theory.
So if we really are dead, the white light means salvation, while the whirlpool means eternal damnation.
Milo didn't answer her question, but the conclusion Sally had come to seemed like an obvious one. Still, there was something which I couldn't understand. But the people at the front of the line are guaranteed to reach salvation, while those at the rear will surely get sucked into hell. Why are some saved and others doomed? I waited for an answer, but a moment later, the trumpet sounded once again, forcing us to cover our ears and making further conversation impossible. And of course, the whole ritual played out again, as a solitary figure gladly walked into the light, while the poor sap at the rear was pulled into the whirlwind, screaming in abject terror as the vortex took him. The line had become shorter, and it was now clear to everyone standing there what was going on here. The fear in the icy cold air was palpable, and soon the line behind us descended into panic and chaos. I heard shouts and screams, looking back over my shoulder to see violent scuffles breaking out, as desperate souls tried to fight their way forward and put as much distance between themselves and the vortex as they could. The results were tragically inevitable. The white lines were only 3 feet apart at most. If people had been more cooperative, they could have slipped past one another and reorganized the line in a sensible manner, but nobody wanted to be left at the back when the dust settled, and so fights broke out, desperate struggles which resulted in several people being thrown over the lines on either side. And of course, the monsters were waiting. A dozen or more demons emerged from the shadows, roaring with fury as their red eyes burned in intense hunger. The scene which followed was worse than anything we'd seen thus far, as ravenous monsters greedily tore into their near-helpless victims with claws and teeth. I couldn't bear to watch, and so turned around, but I could still hear the screams and the awful sounds of ripping and tearing. Thankfully, the massacre soon ended. I guess those at the back of the line realized it was futile to try to fight their way forward, and so they stayed within the lines where the demons couldn't reach them. But suddenly, a horrifying thought crossed my mind, and I turned to speak with my ex-girlfriend. "Sally, who's standing behind you?" I asked in a panic.
It's okay. There's a woman behind me, but she hasn't woken up yet. Her head's down and her eyes are closed.
I breathed a sigh of relief, thinking that Sally was safe, for the time being at least. "What about you, Milo?" I asked, addressing my question to the faceless man ahead of me.
Don't worry about me. I know how to look after myself.
I had little doubt this was the case, and of course, Milo was ahead of us in the line. None of us said anything for a time, but once again, our attention was drawn to the front of the line, where there was another unexpected and gut-wrenching development. We heard the sounds of an argument from 2 people at the head of the line, a man and a woman by the sounds of their voices. Their conversation was muted at first, but soon grew loud enough so that we could hear from a couple 100 yards away. I don't know whether the 2 of them knew each other outside of this hellscape, but they were having a heated discussion, with the man wanting to take action and the woman being against it. Finally, the man cried out in defiance, shouting,
Screw it! I'm not waiting a moment longer! I'm going through!
With that, I saw the man charging toward the white light, determined to make it into the portal. The man didn't pass through a porous membrane like the others. Instead, he charged into a wall of flames, screaming in total agony as his skin and flesh burnt fiercely, as within seconds he was engulfed by the unholy inferno, his body reduced to mere ashes. The man's female companion yelled out in grief, and the rest of the line fell into a chilling silence.
We've all got to follow the rules. There are no shortcuts.
For once, I understood what he meant, and my jaw dropped when I considered what had just occurred. The man at the head of the line had suffered an agonizing, fiery death, and all because he was impatient. If only he'd waited until the trumpets blew, he would have safely crossed over to paradise. Slowly but surely, the line moved forward. We were now 1 step closer to salvation, but no one was likely to make the same mistake. Nevertheless, the situation continued to develop in an unexpected way. We heard muttered chatter from all along the line, dozens of separate conversations, but which surely related to the same topic, survival. And then something extraordinary occurred. People began to swap places in the line voluntarily, carefully pushing past each other whilst ensuring that nobody stepped outside the lines. There weren't many changes to the pre-arranged order, but there were some, and these transfers were apparently done after mutual agreement and without the threat of violence. I was astonished, particularly when I saw the bald-headed man who now took the unenviable position at the very end of the line. But he did not seem afraid of his imminent damnation. Instead, he sat down, cross-legged on the cold ground, his form illuminated by the burning red of the vortex. I watched as he closed his eyes and remained perfectly still, as if in a deep meditation. I couldn't understand why at the time, but he seemed to have accepted his fate. And with that, the ominous trumpets blared, drowning out all other sounds as the now familiar cycle played out once again. I guess the woman at the top of the line had recovered from seeing her male companion burnt alive, because she slowly and carefully stepped into the light and safely passed through to the other side. And meanwhile, the bald-headed man at the rear maintained his monk-like composure right to the very end. He didn't fight or even scream when the vortex sucked him in, and his limp body disappeared into apparent oblivion. I shook my head in disbelief. It was clear that something significant was happening here, but I couldn't quite put my finger on what it was and how it impacted us. But Sally was quicker off the mark, which I suppose I should have expected. She'd always been smarter than me and knew how to cope in a crisis situation. I'd learned as much during the incident 2 years before. Still, as well as I thought I knew my ex-girlfriend, I never could have predicted what she'd do next.
Hey Milo, how are you holding up?
She said suddenly. I looked over my shoulder in confusion, only to see her giving me a knowing look. I'd seen that look before and knew what it meant. Sally wanted me to trust her and keep my mouth shut, and so this is what I did. I suspected she wanted Milo to turn around so she can make eye contact, but by now I knew this wouldn't happen. For whatever reason, our mysterious new friend was determined to keep his eyes facing forward.
I'm doing just fine.
He answered, a response which struck me as odd.
Why do you ask?
Sally seemed frustrated by Milo's reply, but she persevered nonetheless.
Well, I feel like the three of us are in this together. But we know nothing about you, Milo. As you know, Josh and I were in a serious relationship. Things didn't work out. But we're still close. And we share custody of our son.
I spun around in shock, opening my mouth to challenge my ex, but when I did so, she shot me a hard look and raised a finger up to her lips, silently telling me to stay quiet and go along with this. Obviously, Sally was lying. We never had a child together. We talked about it, but our relationship ended abruptly soon after the incident, and our dreams of having a family died at the same time. But now Sally was claiming we had a son together. I didn't understand why she made up this fictional child, but I soon found out.
You have a son?
Milo asked hesitantly.
Yes. His name's Kevin, and he's 2 years old. A real rascal sometimes, but he's as sweet as punch.
I was shocked by how deeply invested Sally was in this lie she'd manufactured from thin air. It was frightening how she was willing to add details to make it more convincing.
I was driving to pick Kevin up from my parents' house when this all happened. I just hope he's not too upset and wondering where his mommy is.
She let this sentence hang in the air for a moment, I guess for the maximum emotional impact. I couldn't bear to look at her, and didn't wish to be part of her deception, and yet I couldn't bring myself to speak out against Sally, because I realized I still owed her a massive debt. Milo hadn't responded verbally to Sally's words, but she eventually followed up with a question.
Do you have children, Milo?
She asked purposefully. Milo's reply surprised me, but his usual cold demeanor broke down, and he suddenly became upset and angry.
No, I never had any kids. My wife and I wanted to, but we never got the chance.
I think Sally was taken aback by his emotional response, but she soon regained her composure and continued with her ruse.
I'm really sorry to hear that, Milo.
She said in what I knew was mock sympathy.
But we do have a baby boy. And in situations like this, don't you think parents should get priority?
Suddenly, I got it. I guess I was slow to understand what my ex was doing. Milo was in front of both of us in the line, so he would reach the safety of the light before we did. We might survive either way, but Sally was hedging her bets, trying to get Milo to voluntarily switch places so a loving parent could survive to get home to her child. I guess this lie was meant to help me as well, but I still didn't like it. We'd told too many lies already, and there had to be consequences for our deception. Nevertheless, I didn't say a word, instead waiting for Milo's response. But before he had an opportunity to answer, the trumpet sounded once again. As we covered our ears, the familiar pattern took place before our eyes, with one figure stepping into the light and another getting sucked into the vortex. In the aftermath, an individual broke from the line and stepped into the shadowy kill zone. I was shocked to see this figure was little more than a child, an adolescent boy with wild terror in his eyes. I didn't see whether the kid was pushed or if he ran, but he was quick on his feet and seemed determined to make a break for it. Inevitably, a gang of 3 bloodthirsty demons emerged from the shadows and grasped out at the kid with their claws, but amazingly, the kid dodged all of them, making it past the trio of monsters and sprinting into the darkness. He disappeared from sight, and for a brief moment, I thought he actually could make it to safety. But then we heard a blood-curdling scream, closely followed by the cracking of bones and the ominous sound of a huge beast biting into flesh. And I realized that the kid had fallen victim to some yet unseen horror lurking in the shadows. My heart sank in that moment, but Sally's devious plan was still very much in play. Milo predictably didn't react to the kid's violent death, but he did recall the conversation we were having before the trumpet sounded.
So, you think you should just go ahead of me because you have a kid?
He asked, his voice returning to his characteristic, emotionless tone. I remained silent, but Sally spoke up on our behalf.
Frankly, yes. I don't want to be brutal about it, but we deserve the chance to see our boy again.
But if we really are dead, then what difference does it make?
I had to admit that he had a good point there. I didn't know how Sally would respond to this direct question, which poked a massive hole in her story, but of course, she had a pre-prepared argument.
But we don't know that we're dead. Not for sure. If we have been abducted, then reaching the light could bring us home. And besides, even if we have passed away, don't you think 2 loving parents deserve to go to heaven?
I didn't know how Milo would react to this loaded question, but I certainly didn't expect what happened next, because suddenly Milo began to laugh, quietly at first, but growing ever louder. But his laughter wasn't one of mirth. Instead, it was filled with bitterness and scorn. I turned around to look upon Sally, only to find she was as baffled as I was. We had no choice but to wait until Milo finished his mad cackling and opened his mouth to speak, his voice now filled with passionate anger.
You really don't know who I am, do you? I hope there'd be some recognition, some remorse. But now I realize this is beyond you both.
I shook my head in confusion, feeling like there was something I should have picked up on, but sadly, I remained oblivious. I'm sorry, Milo, I don't understand.
You don't, huh? Well, maybe it's about time you saw my face.
And with that, he slowly began to turn around for the first time. I stood there in nervous anticipation, my entire body trembling because I suspected what we'd see would not be pleasant. And when his face was illuminated, I recoiled as my most painful memory came back to punch me in the gut. Milo's face was in actual fact a grotesque death mask, his dead eyes bulging and his forehead caked in dried blood. His skin looked like leather, and when he opened his crusty lips, green water poured from his mouth and nostrils. I heard Sally scream behind me, and I was about to follow suit, but in that moment, the trumpet sounded louder than ever this time. I fell to my knees and buried my head in my hands, but the almighty din was too intense. I felt like my head was about to explode, and then I found myself drifting out of consciousness, as suddenly my whole world went black. And then I was in another place in time, thrust back to a point in my life which I had tried my hardest to forget. Sally and I were in the car, driving along a lonely country road late at night. We were coming home from a party, and we were in high spirits. We'd both been drinking, I was driving, and surely over the limit, but I'd made this journey a dozen times before, and I thought it would be fine. I remember the 2 of us laughing over a shared joke. I glanced over to the passenger seat, looking into Sally's mischievous eyes and feeling so much love for her in that moment, but I should have kept my eyes on the road because I didn't see the pedestrian until it was too late. A sudden panic overtook me as I slammed my foot on the brakes, but I hit the man head on. His broken body was thrown up onto the hood before it smashed against the windshield. I brought the car to a stop as the body fell heavily to the ground, and I sat, frozen, still gripping a tight hold on the steering wheel and in a state of shock. Slowly, I turned to look at Sally and saw an expression of sheer horror etched across her face.
Joshua, what have you done?
And I didn't have an answer. After some time, we exited the vehicle and went to see my victim. What we found was a bloody mess of a man, a human body broken almost beyond recognition. We were both sure he was dead. Sally and I stood there under the headlights on the side of the abandoned road, looking down at the corpse of the young man I'd just run over. And then I really started to panic.
Sally, what am I gonna do? I've killed a man. They'll send me to prison for this.
That's not going to happen.
Sally answered firmly, her eyes narrowing as she took control of the situation.
There are no witnesses. Nobody saw what happened.
She paused briefly, letting those words sink in.
The lake is only 5 miles from here. We can make him disappear.
I glared at her in shock and disbelief, disgusted by the suggestion. But of course, I went along with her plan. I didn't wish to face the consequences of my actions, and so I conspired with my girlfriend to cover up the crime. With some difficulty, we lifted the body and loaded it into the trunk of my car. I vividly recall seeing the man's grotesque death mask, his dead eyes looking upward into the night sky as we slammed the trunk shut and sealed him inside. We drove to the lake, exiting the car at the top of a disused dock after releasing the handbrake, watching in solemn silence as the vehicle rolled downwards and disappeared under the water's surface. Sally and I made the long walk home that night, barely speaking a word as the seriousness of our crime hit home. We reported the car stolen the next morning, Sally giving the report to a disinterested police officer who didn't ask too many questions. A few days later, we heard a missing persons report on the news. A young man who had been walking at night and never made it home. In the days and weeks which followed, I lived in a state of constant anxiety, forever fearing a knock on the door, but the cops never made the connection and didn't find the body. I guess it was about 2 months later when Sally and I were watching TV at home, and suddenly there was a press conference featuring a teary-eyed woman giving a statement with the photograph of the missing man framed behind her. She pleaded for anyone with information to come forward and wept as she begged for her husband to come home, and the missing man's name was Milo. Suddenly, my ears were filled with the sound of the trumpets, and I was brought back to the dark hellscape, except the circumstances had changed during my absence. The first thing I noticed, before I even opened my eyes, was the overbearing heat. Before, this place had been ice cold, but now the opposite was true. And simultaneously, my nostrils were filled with an awful stench of sulfur and burning flesh, making me retch in disgust. But when my eyes opened, I almost jumped out of my skin, and I started to stumble until a pair of arms grabbed me and held me up.
Remember the rules. Stay within the lines and they can't get you.
I glanced into her wide eyes, wondering if she had experienced the same gut-wrenching flashback I had during our blackout. The look of terror etched on her now drawn face told me she surely had, but this wasn't the reason she was so frightened. The demons weren't in the shadows any longer. They were standing right beside us, so close that I could smell their foul breath, which stank of rotting flesh, and see the fresh blood dripping from their sharp fangs. There were 6 of the beasts visible on either side of the white lines, appearing like soldiers standing to attention. They didn't make any attempt to attack, but the monsters shot us murderous glares through their burning red eyes, and they grinded their razor-sharp teeth and clicked their long tongues, as if eagerly anticipating the kills to come. But they couldn't get to us, not as long as we stayed in the line. And the line was much shorter now. I guess Sally and I had been out for longer than we thought as we relived our past sins, because whereas the line had once included hundreds of lost souls, now there were only 5 of us. The doorway of white light was right in front of us, while the crimson vortex lay behind us. The 2 gateways competing to drown out the darkness, but the intolerable heat and disgusting stench came from our rear. And I had no doubt that the vortex was a portal to hell itself. In the moment which followed, the terrifying process repeated, as the anonymous figure at the front of the line crossed over and the woman behind Sally screamed as the hellish whirlpool sucked her inside, and then there were only the three of us. In all the chaos, I'd almost forgotten about Milo, but the ghoul was still facing us, his dead eyes burning with rage as he savored his moment of retribution.
Tell me,
He snarled through his rotting maw.
do you two feel any guilt? Any remorse for what you did to me? For what you took from me?
I struggled to find the words to respond as I experienced a foul, burning sensation in the back of my head. I knew I couldn't hide from this any longer.
Milo, of course we're sorry for what happened, but it was an accident. You've got to believe that.
Milo laughed bitterly once again.
An accident? Was it an accident when you bundled me into your trunk and pushed your car into the lake? Was that an accident?
He paused briefly, his lifeless eyes narrowing.
I was still alive when I went into the water. Did you know that?
I shook my head in disbelief, muttering.
No, that's not possible.
It's true.
Milo confirmed with a nod.
I slowly suffocated to death inside of that trunk, and they never found my body. My wife never got closure, never got to bring me home, and that's all because of the two of you!
Milo was now beyond fury as he roared and charged towards Sally and I with his arms outstretched. Sally screamed, but he was already on me, his skeleton-like hands wrapping around my throat in an attempt to throttle me. I fought back with all my might, tackling Milo and shoving him to one side, and of course, he fell out of the lines. Milo released his grip on my throat as the demons grabbed hold of him, their eyes lighting up with a ravenous hunger as they dug their claws into his flesh. Milo didn't fight or scream when they took him. He merely looked up at us with sad resignation as they dragged him into the darkness. I glanced down at my own hands in disbelief, realizing that I'd killed this innocent man for the second time. The rest of the demons retreated at this point, cackling cruelly as they returned to the shadows. As I watched them go, I felt an immense guilt eating away at me, and I knew it should have been me. It was Sally who broke me from my trance, placing a firm hand on my shoulder and forcing me to look her in the eye.
Joshua, are you doing okay?
She asked sympathetically. I shook my head, muttering,
I'm a killer.
You did what you had to do, Josh. You were trying to protect me. But I need your help one last time.
What do you mean?
I shot back in confusion. She sighed deeply, probably frustrated by my lack of awareness.
Come on, Josh. There's only two of us left now. What's going to happen when the trumpets sound?
And suddenly I was up to speed. I was standing in front of Sally on the line and was closest to the white light of salvation.
You want to swap places?
I said ominously.
You want me to sacrifice myself for you?
I wondered what I thought about this idea. It certainly wasn't an appealing offer. I was terrified by the vortex and whatever hell lay beyond it. But of course I was. But would I screw over the woman I'd once loved to save my own skin? It had never crossed my mind that it would come to this, but I think Sally had always envisioned this outcome. Sally had always been one step ahead, and in the end, she had the words to persuade me. She held my hand tighter, tears in her eyes as her tone became increasingly emotional.
I know it's a lot to ask, Josh. But remember, I saved you after the accident. You said you couldn't face prison, and I made the problem go away. I don't deserve to suffer for your sins. You know that, Josh.
I opened my mouth to respond, but we'd run out of time. The trumpets blared aloud, drowning out our conversation. I needed to make a decision right now, and I went with my heart over my head. In an instant, I grabbed hold of Sally's waist, embracing and kissing her one last time before pushing her ahead of me on the line. The terrible noise made any further words impossible, but in the last moment, Sally smiled back at me gently and mouthed, "Thank you." And as she did so, I remembered all the tenderness and love we'd once had for each other. But I couldn't escape the nagging suspicion that she'd played me. But Sally didn't wait, soon turning her back on me and confidently walking into the light. And then I felt the irresistible pull from behind me as the all-powerful vortex sucked me in. I felt my skin burning and the air leaving my lungs, and then I was gone from that place, never to return. I didn't know what exactly to expect once I regained consciousness and adjusted to my new environment. I knew it wasn't going to be a good place, but my panicked mind was filled with images of burning lakes of sulfur and sadistic demons wielding pitchforks. But the space I found myself in was quite unexpected. I was inside of a car, sitting in the driver's seat. But it wasn't just any vehicle. It was my car from 2 years prior. The same car I'd been driving on the night of the accident, the night I'd killed poor Milo for the first time. And that wasn't all. I was underwater, surrounded by dark, flowing liquid on all sides, with the only illumination coming from the light above the dashboard. I started to panic, struggling to breathe as I desperately tried to open the doors, only to find they would not budge. Next, I kicked out the windshield, which was already shattered from the night of the accident, but when I kicked the glass, I discovered it was rock hard and unbreakable. I cried out in angry frustration, slamming my fists on the wheel and hearing the muffled sound of the horn. But then I heard a chilling, deep voice from behind me.
I wouldn't bother if I were you. There's no way out.
I jumped and turned around, seeing a dark figure sitting in my back seat. I knew he hadn't been there a second before, and so he'd seemingly materialized out of thin air. The man, if that's what he was, appeared well-dressed in a finely tailored suit, seamless white shirt and black bow tie. But I couldn't see his face as it remained hidden in the shadows. Thus far, he'd only offered me what seemed like advice. Nevertheless, there was something very disturbing about his tone of voice and whole demeanor, and so I guessed this mysterious individual was no friend of mine. I felt like history was repeating itself and feared the worst, struggling to speak through trembling lips and asking,
What is this place?
Isn't it obvious?
The shadowy figure replied. It was, of course, and I needed to face the grim reality of my situation.
I'm in hell, aren't I? This is my personal hell.
The shadow man responded with a sly chuckle before saying,
Certainly not, Joshua. This is a halfway house of sorts, and call it purgatory if you will. Believe me, you'd know if you were in hell.
I experienced a wave of emotion in that moment. Relief for sure, but as always, I was confused.
I don't understand. I was sucked into the vortex. I smelt the sulfur, felt my body burning.
You made an assumption.
The man replied abruptly.
Did anyone tell you that one portal led to heaven and the other to hell?
I pondered his words for a moment until the horrifying implications became apparent.
Sally!
I exclaimed.
What happened to Sally?
The man sighed before answering.
Sally is somewhere else. Don't worry about her now, Joshua. You won't see her again. Not for a while, anyway.
I gulped, feeling a chill as I thought of my ex-girlfriend and feared for her safety. But it seemed there wasn't anything I could do for her right now.
And what about me?
I muttered nervously.
What will become of me?
There was a lengthy, almost unbearable pause before the shadow man answered me.
I'll be honest with you, Joshua. You've got us in a bit of a pickle. On one side, you committed a heinous sin on the mortal plane, but then you made a noble sacrifice in the Shadowlands to save a woman you once loved. Your sacrifice was futile in the end, but you weren't to know that. We're going to need some time to consider your fate, Joshua. In the meantime, you can stay here in this watery prison of your own making.
I experienced a renewed panic and also anger, crying out before I had a chance to think.
No, you can't keep me here. I won't stay.
The shadow man's reaction was instant and furious. He leaned forward, allowing me to see his hideous eyes through the darkness, which reminded me of the vortex I'd been pulled into, mesmerizing and yet terrifying at the same time. When he spoke,
You'll do what we tell you. Do not test me, you wretched mortal. I can make all your worst nightmares come to life.
I'd never been as frightened as I was in that moment, not during my mortal existence or even in the Shadowlands. Whatever this entity was, I realized he could inflict suffering upon me that I couldn't even imagine. I had no words to respond, and so merely grabbed hold of the steering wheel and lowered my head in meek submission.
Very well,
the Shadow Man said with a smug satisfaction.
Goodbye, Joshua. Until we meet again.
I nervously glanced up into the rearview mirror and saw the entity melting away into the leather seat. And then I was alone. To this day, I remain trapped in this watery grave, staring out at the bottom of the lake, which was the scene of my worst crime. I don't know how long I've been here. All I know is that I can't leave, not unless they set me free. I assume the Shadow Man will eventually return to reveal my ultimate fate, but for now, all I have is time. I've had what seems like an eternity to come to terms with what I've done. I think about Sally often, and Milo too. Will I ever see them again? I hope so, because when all my sins and regrets are washed away, all I want to do is make amends. I don't know how long I was held in my watery prison. A month, a year, a decade? There was no way for me to measure time. 2 years before my death, I committed a terrible crime, and now I was suffering an ironic punishment, courtesy of the demon being who controlled this hellish realm. I'd been subjected to their twisted test, but the results were inconceivable. And so, I'd been sent here to a sealed car at the bottom of a dark lake, left to rot while they considered my fate. I'd done everything I could think of to escape this hell, kicking against the windshield until my legs ached, attempting to tear through the upholstery on the back seat, and trying to dismantle the car's interior with my bare hands. I worked frantically for hours until my hands were raw and bloody, but then I blinked, and everything was back to the way it was. I tried to end it all on a couple of occasions, smashing my head against the dashboard as I sought to crack my skull open, but it didn't matter how severely I injured myself. The same thing happened every time. I could not die, and whenever I regained consciousness, all my injuries were miraculously healed. They say hell is other people, but for me it was the tedium and loneliness. In the end, I gave up on all attempts at suicide or escape, and all I had was my thoughts. I don't know how long it took for my sanity to go. I would stare into the dark waters for hours or even days on end, and I started to see things. Hideous monsters swimming along the bottom of the lake, glaring at me through the darkness with predatory eyes, and hungrily anticipating any opportunity to devour my flesh. There were times I would have gladly allowed the beast to end me, but the glass between us was impenetrable. Other times, I swore I got a glimpse of something in my rear mirror, jumping at the sight of a ghostly face in the back seat. Sometimes it was my ex-girlfriend, Sally. Other times my victim, Milo. And on occasion, I saw the dark-suited demon who had banished me here, an entity with swirling, vortex-like eyes who scared me more than any other horror. Was I going mad, or were the demons just messing with me? I couldn't tell, and ultimately, I hardly even cared. All I wanted was for this hell to end, but as time passed, I began to lose hope, fearing that the demons had forgotten about me, and I'd be trapped here for all eternity. Therefore, I can't tell you the shock I experienced when, with the mere blink of an eye, I was transported to another place. My heart jumped when I looked through the cracked windshield and saw the road ahead. I was still in my car, but the vehicle was no longer at the bottom of that cursed lake. Instead, the car was on an abandoned, narrow road at night, surrounded by darkened forest on either side, with the only illumination coming from the vehicle's headlights. I panicked, fearing I would drive off the road and into a tree, but nothing happened when I grabbed hold of the steering wheel and put my foot down on the brake. I had no control over the vehicle, which appeared to be self-driving. Taking a deep breath, I sat back in my seat and observed my new environment, realizing I was entirely helpless and at the whim of whatever hellish entity had me in their grasp. The car drove for what seemed like miles, the roads twisting and cutting deeper into the dark and foreboding forest. I tried to focus on the road, fearing what I would see beyond the tree line, but on occasion, I couldn't help but glance into the black abyss. When I did so, I swore I could see shadows moving through the woods, unidentified creatures with burning red eyes that watched me closely as I progressed through their dark realm. The road reminded me of the line of the damned souls trapped between the light and the vortex. If that had been my first test, Was this my second? If not, what was the point of it? I soon got an answer, of sorts. My possessed car turned a corner, and I came face to face with a horrific scene. There was another car parked on the side of the road, identical to the one I was in. That's not to say it was the same make and model, but rather an exact carbon copy, right down to the cracked windshield and dent in the hood. My jaw dropped as my headlights illuminated two darkened figures at the rear of the parked vehicle, loading what was clearly a body into the trunk. The first was my doppelganger, an exact double, at first glance at least, and the second was Sally, my ex-girlfriend and accomplice in this crime. I was revisiting my worst moment, the night I killed Milo in a drunken hit and run and conspired with Sally to make his body disappear. I continued watching the ghoulish reenactment play out as my vehicle drove past the crash site. My doppelganger and the copy of Sally ignored my car until the last second, when they looked up and met my gaze, their eyes jet black like those of a shark. I turned away in shocked horror, focusing on the road as my car kept on driving. I couldn't look back, but this leg of my journey was almost complete. The forest on the right-hand side of the road gave way to a body of dark water, one which I recognized all too well. My heart sank as I feared the puppet masters would send me back to the lake's bottom, but this wasn't what happened. I spotted a boathouse by the lake's side, with a dim light emanating from within the wooden structure, and suddenly the car came to a stop by the side of the road about 20 or 30 yards short of the boathouse. I heard a soft click and was astonished to realize the car's doors were now unlocked. I couldn't quite believe that they were releasing me from my prison, and a part of me feared a trick. I wanted time to consider my next move, but the solution quickly deteriorated. I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, turning my head in time to see a large humanoid creature launching itself from the top branches of a tree, unveiling a large pair of wings as it screeched loudly and took flight. The shadowy monster disappeared from my line of sight for a moment, but then there was a heavy crash on the top of my car as the creature landed. I screamed as the winged beast shrieked in excitement and started clawing at the roof. The creature was powerful, and its claws were more than capable of cutting through metal. I knew it wouldn't be long before it broke through, and I only had one chance. Opening the driver's door with a shaky hand, I jumped out of the vehicle and started to run. I shouldn't have looked back over my shoulder, but couldn't help myself. The beast was a winged, gargoyle-like creature with an impressive wingspan, large and pointed ears, and burning demonic eyes. It continued to claw at the car's roof for a moment, unaware that I had already escaped. But the beast soon realized its mistake, wailing like a banshee as it shot me a murderous glare, unveiling its wings and taking off. I kept on running, sprinting as fast as my legs would carry me. There was only one place I could go, the boathouse. I didn't think I'd make it, but somehow I covered the distance whilst the screaming beast raced towards me. I saw the door of the boathouse lying open and made straight for it, leaping the last few yards as the gargoyle descended, its claws only inches from my back. I landed heavily on the hardwood floor, darting up and slamming the door shut behind me. I didn't expect this to stop the beast, but to my astonishment, I watched through the door's portal-type window as the wailing gargoyle withdrew, flapping its wings as it retreated back towards the treetops. Breathing a deep sigh of relief, I turned around to face a fresh horror as I surveyed my surroundings. The interior of the boathouse took on the form of a rundown dive bar, complete with sawdust on the floor and the stench of spilt alcohol and something much fouler. It was dark and dilapidated inside of the bar, and this certainly wasn't the type of venue I would have frequented during my drinking days. Nevertheless, the unpleasant interior of the bar room didn't concern me, at least not as much as the terrifying figure standing behind the bar. I stood frozen in awestruck horror as I observed the demonic entity casually cleaning glasses behind a blood-red counter and with a bar stacked with label-less green bottles. He looked up when he saw me, his impossible, vortex-like eyes placing me in a trance as I found myself under his dark spell. He formed his lips into a smile of sorts, although it certainly didn't put me at ease.
Ah, Joshua, I'm so glad you could make it. You must be thirsty after your journey. Let me offer you a drink. On the house, of course.
I was puzzled by the Shadow Man's words and unconvinced by his supposedly amicable welcome. The last time I'd spoken with this demon, he'd confined me to my watery prison, warning me that a far worse fate could await me. Naturally, I was terrified of the entity and wanted nothing to do with him. I certainly didn't want to accept a drink from this demon. Nevertheless, I was now entirely under the Shadow Man's control, and before I knew it, I was slowly walking towards the bar. My feet moving, even though my brain was screaming, "Stop!" I reached the bar, but didn't dare to look into the Shadow Man's swirling and bewitching eyes. I kept my head down, focusing on the demon's immaculate dinner suit and bow tie, watching his bony hands as he grabbed 2 glasses and an unidentified green bottle from the top shelf.
Scotch on the rocks. That's your poison, right?
I opened my trembling lips, struggling to speak in response.
I don't.
But he didn't give me a chance to finish, as he carefully poured 2 glasses of smooth whiskey and pushed them across the bar towards me.
Here you go, Joshua. 1 large whiskey for you, and the same for your friend over there.
His bony finger pointed to the corner of the room, and I turned to face the figure sitting alone in a darkened booth, his head raised as he stared back at me. My heart beat fast in my chest and my body trembled, but I can't say I was surprised. The dark eyes glaring toward me belonged to Milo, the man I'd killed 2 years ago before conspiring with Sally to dispose of his body. The last time I saw him, Milo was being dragged into the Shadowlands by a gang of bloodthirsty demons. I felt sure they would rip him to shreds, but yet here he was, sitting in the bathroom and apparently waiting for me. I hesitated for a long moment as we locked eyes. I didn't want to go to Milo, but I couldn't run away from this. I'd done this man a great wrong, and now I needed to make amends, or at least attempt to do so. I took a deep breath, putting my head down as I walked across the sawdust-covered floor, my hands shaking as I struggled to keep hold of the 2 glasses. As I got closer, I could see Milo's mangled face, his forehead still covered in dried blood as it had been the last time I saw him. When Milo previously confronted us in the line, he'd attempted to throttle Sally and me in a mad fit of rage. I wondered whether he still desired revenge against me. I couldn't blame Milo if he did, but there was no way of predicting the ghoul's intentions from his cold, emotionless eyes. I stood over the table for a long moment, meeting his gaze and resisting the urge to recoil in disgust at his gruesome injuries. The tension was almost unbearable, and I found myself unable to speak. In the end, it was Milo who broke the silence.
Take a seat, Joshua.
He pointed to the wooden bench on the opposite side of the table. I hesitated for only a second before sitting down and placing the 2 glasses on the table. Milo nodded his head before using his twisted right hand to awkwardly pick up his glass and hold it aloft.
Now then, Josh, how about taking a drink with me?
My jaw dropped as I looked down at the glass before me, feeling sick as I smelt the strong brown liquor contained within it. I glanced up at Milo's dead eyes, shaking my head vigorously as I sputtered out my response.
I don't drink, Milo. I gave up after.
What? You gave up the booze after killing me while drink driving? Well, that hardly matters now, does it?
I broke eye contact with the ghoul, struggling to control my emotions as I continued staring at the glass.
I can't.
I'm afraid I must insist, Joshua.
I looked up and saw his pale and emaciated face twisted up in anger. I knew from the previous experience how quickly Milo could lose his temper, and so submitted to his wishes, grasping my glass with a shaking hand and raising it up to meet that of my unlikely companion.
Cheers!
Milo exclaimed more amicably as he clinked his glass against mine. I watched as he downed his drink, pouring it down the gaping black hole that was his mouth. I paused for a second before following suit, coughing as the hard liquor forced its way down my throat. But then something extraordinary occurred. I felt a raw energy flowing through my veins, a burst of adrenaline which cut through my dread and gave me a renewed confidence and hope. And then I looked across the table and saw Milo transformed. He was no longer a mangled, walking corpse. Instead, Milo was restored to his former self, the young, vibrant man he'd been before the accident and his untimely death. I was astonished and once again left speechless, but Milo simply smiled and shot me a wink as he said,
I think it's high time we had a heart-to-heart, don't you, Josh?
I nodded my head vigorously as tears welled up in my eyes.
I really am so sorry, Milo.
I whimpered emotionally. I knew how inadequate my apology was, but Milo's reaction surprised me.
I know you're sorry, Joshua, but we're past that now.
He sighed deeply, staring longingly at his now empty glass before continuing.
I'm guessing you have a lot of questions, and you're not going to get any answers from him.
He nodded over to the Shadow Man, who continued to wipe down glasses behind the bar, apparently disinterested in our conversation.
You know what's happening here, Milo?
I asked, feeling an unsettling sense of déjà vu as I did so.
I believe I have the answers you need.
He answered cryptically. He let that statement hang in the air for a moment. Meanwhile, I felt like my brain was on fire. I had so many questions, it was difficult to know where to start. So I returned to the events of our last meeting.
I saw you die. The demons took you.
Milo shot a sly half-smile before replying.
I was already dead, remember? The demons can hurt us. They can rip you to pieces, but you always come back. You pass out from the pain, and when you regain consciousness, you're right back where you started. That's the true hell, Joshua. To know there's no peace. No final release from all the pain and the fear.
He broke eye contact, looking down at his empty glass and perhaps wishing it would magically refill. His words chilled me, but I reckon Milo must be telling the truth. Still, there was so much I didn't understand.
The line. I thought it was about salvation, about who makes it to paradise and who gets dragged to hell, but it wasn't that simple, was it?
Milo raised his head, appearing thoughtful for a moment as he looked over at the bar. There was a lengthy pause before he eventually replied.
It wasn't about salvation, but rather redemption. The purpose was to test us, to see how we'd react when backed against a wall.
He turned to face me, a fiery intensity in his eyes as he spoke to me in a serious tone.
You've got to understand something, Joshua. The three of us are tied together. Ever since you ran me down that night, our fates have been intertwined. We three were tested in the line, and we all fell short.
I shook my head in confusion. Perhaps I'm not the brightest, but none of this made any sense to me.
I can understand why Sally and I were punished, but why you, Milo? You were the wronged party.
True, but my test was forgiveness, and I failed completely. I let hatred and a desire for revenge pollute my soul, and for that, I'm sorry.
I looked into his dark eyes with astonishment, not believing what I'd just heard. Milo was sorry for not forgiving me? I reckoned he had good cause to bear a grudge, but I guess that's not how it works in the afterlife. But still, I clearly wasn't the good guy in this story, and I had wronged Milo. Not once, but twice.
I failed in the line,
I admitted.
I should have made amends, but instead I threw you to the demons.
Milo sighed deeply before replying, swallowing an old bitterness that he was trying hard to put behind him.
Yes, you failed on that score, but you did what was necessary to save Sally. You sacrificed yourself for her. That's the only reason you're not in hell right now.
An ice-cold chill ran through me as I realized how close I'd come to eternal damnation, but this left me with an obvious question.
What about Sally? Where is she?
Milo nodded ominously, like he'd been anticipating this very question.
Sally is in a bad place right now, but she's not beyond redemption. We can help her. Correction, we must help her.
I thought Milo was joking, but when I looked him in the eye, I saw he was deadly serious. But why would Milo want to help Sally? She was my ex-girlfriend, the woman I'd once loved with all my heart, but my feelings towards her now were complicated. I don't like the idea of her suffering, but couldn't forget how she'd behaved in the line, playing us both to save her own skin. I thought about concealing this fact from Milo, but there'd been too many lies already.
You know she lied,
I muttered.
She lied to you, Milo.
He didn't seem surprised by this revelation, and his reply confused me even further.
Sally lied about some things, but not about everything.
What do you mean?
Milo twisted up his face like he didn't understand my question.
You don't remember how you died?
My brain ached as I desperately tried to think. I'd spent so long inside that damned car trying to recall the details of my death. There were fleeting memories, but nothing solid. As hard as I tried, I couldn't fill in the gaps.
I remember being in my car.
Was my eventual and uncertain reply.
I think I was in an accident.
Milo looked visibly sad in that moment, as if he genuinely felt sympathy for me.
You weren't in a car accident. But don't worry about that now. We've got to go.
Go where?
I asked as my frustration grew.
Go to get Sally. She needs our help, and I promise you, Joshua, you'll find the answers you seek on our journey.
Suddenly, Milo stood up from his chair and started walking towards the bar, briefly turning his head to look upon me before he proceeded. I continued to sit in the booth, confused and uncertain, but realizing Milo wanted me to follow him. I was frightened by what lay ahead, yet I didn't want to stay here in limbo. I cast a glance towards the Shadow Man, avoiding the swirling orbs he had in place of eyes. I didn't know whether I could trust Milo, but I sure as hell didn't want to stay here with him. And so I stood up on shaking legs and cautiously followed in Milo's footsteps. I deliberately avoided the Shadow Man's gaze as I walked, but noted how he casually returned to the menial task of wiping down the bar top while seemingly ignoring us both. But as Milo and I passed the bar, he called out amicably to us, saying,
"Good luck, gentlemen."
Milo made for the back exit behind the bar, placing his fingers on the door handle before turning his head to face me, his expression still deadly serious as he delivered a stern warning.
Just remember one thing, Joshua. We have a specific mission and we can't get distracted. We are both tied to Sally and she's the one we're going in to save. We'll encounter other lost souls during our odyssey, just like we did in the line, but we can't save them. They're all fighting their own battles and will find their own way in the end. Understand?
I nodded my head, even though I didn't fully comprehend the rules. I didn't know what lay ahead of me, but had little choice but to follow Milo's lead. We exited through the solid oak door and were instantly hit by a stifling heat and a heavy rain which fell upon our heads. It was still nighttime, but the vast body of water before us was dimly illuminated by the pale moonlight. But what drew my attention was the substantial island which sat to our north, upon which was built a medieval castle with high defensive walls and a round tower easily 100 feet in height. I stared at that distant tower for a long moment, focusing on a dim light in a high-up window. I can't quite describe my feelings as I looked upon that burning light. I'd been in many tough spots and witnessed many horrors, but I sensed there was an absolute evil inside of that tower, a monstrosity beyond my meager imagination. And it was watching us. I don't know how I knew this, but somehow I did. This dark entity was closely monitoring our progress through its realm, and it surely didn't welcome our presence here. I stood frozen under the biting rain, unable to divert my gaze from the ominous tower. I was conscious of a far-off storm that appeared to be heading in our direction, with distant thunder and flashes of lightning assaulting my senses. All my instincts told me to turn and run, but Milo gave me strength, grabbing my arm firmly and forcing me to look him in the eye.
We need to get to the island. We've got to do this. For Sally.
For Sally, I repeated uncertainly, as I looked away from the horizon and followed my unlikely ally down the slope leading to the lakeside. I saw a jetty leading out into the dark water. It appeared all too familiar, but I tried not to dwell on this. At the end of the dock was a small rowboat piloted by a dark figure, clad from head to toe in black robes, his face hidden by a hood which covered his head. Milo walked down the jetty and towards the waiting boat, but naturally I hesitated, glaring suspiciously at the hooded figure as I questioned his intentions. Milo turned to face me, visually sighing as he noted my hesitation.
Come on, man!
He exclaimed, raising his voice to be heard over the downpour.
This is the only way to cross the water!
I took a deep breath before proceeding. We took our places on board the small boat, and I tried my hardest not to look at the hooded pilot as we cast off. I dreaded to imagine what he had hidden underneath his hood. I don't know how the boat propelled itself. We weren't rowing, and there was no visible engine, but yet we moved steadily across the dark lake, slowly getting closer to the cursed isle. The lake's surface was bombarded by raindrops, but otherwise the water was still, at least at first. I looked down at the dark water and saw the first ripples. as yet unidentified creatures began to rise from the depths. I gasped when I saw the first of them. A rotting corpse, somehow still living despite the skin and flesh falling from its body. The zombie-like creature stank to high heaven, its dead eyes full of rage and hunger as it focused upon our boat and ferociously swam towards us. I feared what the ghoul would do to us, but a moment later, a second corpse broke through the surface, promptly attacking the first. Soon, the two zombies were tearing at each other with their bare hands and nails, roaring like wild animals and slowly dismembering each other until the rotting remains sank beneath the surface. This scene was soon replicated across the lake and on all sides of our little boat as dozens of zombies emerged and violently fought against each other, ripping bodies to shreds and filling the lake with blood. A few managed to fight their way through the scrum of bodies, desperately approaching our boat with their arms outstretched, but our hooded pilot soon saw them off, hissing and scaring the dead, forcing them back under the water. After a while, I no longer feared the zombies. Instead, I pitied them. But I remembered Milo's words. We couldn't help these people and had to focus on our mission. Thankfully, we soon navigated through the lake of the dead, although our situation certainly didn't improve once we reached the island. The pilot would not land on the shore, and so we were forced to wade through the shallows to get to the beach. I didn't look back as the boat left us behind. We climbed the steep, muddy slope up from the beach, climbing to the top where we witnessed the monstrous castle in all its terrible glory. The high and thick walls were surrounded by a defensive moat with a drawbridge allowing us to cross. The heavy gates lay open, but the castle was far from undefended. I looked up at the top of the walls, horrified to see winged monsters perched on the turrets, glaring down at us with a murderous intent in their red, glowing eyes. I recognized the beasts, noting their close resemblance to the monster who'd attacked me in the forest, except now there were many of them, 13 at my quick count, all watching us closely as we advanced towards the drawbridge. As always, I followed Milo's lead, but I sensed that he too was scared, noting how his body trembled as he avoided looking at the gargoyles. We reached the drawbridge and began walking across, our boots thumping on wooden planks as we struggled not to slip on the soaking wet surface. I made the mistake of looking down into the deep moat. In the dark waters below, I saw snapping beasts, trapped predators who surely sensed our presence above them, no doubt hoping Milo and I would slip and fall so that they could feast upon our warm flesh. But the unidentified monsters at the bottom of the moat weren't our primary concern. We were halfway across the bridge when we heard a terrifying screeching from above us. I fearfully glanced up in time to see several of the gargoyles taking off from the castle walls, extending their wings as they soared down towards us, their razor-sharp claws extended and their red eyes burning with a predatory zeal.
Run!
Milo screamed as his cool demeanor broke down. I didn't need to be told twice as I sprinted toward the castle gate with Milo by my side, but I didn't think we'd make it. The lead gargoyle was only a few feet above me, wailing like a banshee as it prepared to dig its claws into my back. But suddenly, I saw a projectile flying through the air, turning to watch as the bolt hit the winged monster in its right leg. The gargoyle shrieked in pain, abandoning its attack as it retreated, flying upwards and back to the safety of the battlements above. A moment later, and a second bolt was fired, striking another monster and penetrating its pale flesh. Before long, all the gargoyles were retreating, abandoning their assault under fire. I turned my head, looking back across the moat to see our savior. The figure illuminated by the moonlight was instantly recognizable, even though he had taken on a different form. The vortex-like orbs he had instead of eyes were a dead giveaway. It was the Shadow Man, except he'd now traded his tuxedo for a suit of armor and his bar rag for a crossbow. He nodded at me as he lowered his weapon, and I nodded back in thanks. Although, in truth, I was very confused. For so long, I'd believed this entity was my enemy, committed to punishing me for my sins, but now he'd saved us both. I looked to Milo, and I guess he read my mind, because he promptly offered me an explanation.
He offers us protection, but it has its limits. We're permitted entry to the castle, but we'll need to work quickly. If we can't save Sally in time, all three of us will be trapped here forever.
I stared at Milo in astonishment. How could he have kept this from me? What else did he know that he wasn't telling me? I was angry and scared, but also filled with a fiery determination. It's difficult to explain, but for so long my existence has been empty and without purpose. But now I had a mission, a chance at redemption. I was beginning to understand what Milo meant. I felt it deep inside of me, realizing that the three of us were tied together in death. We had to find Sally and bring her home. It was our only chance to avoid eternal damnation. We entered the gates without further incident, the wounded gargoyles cackling in annoyance as they watched us from the battlements. Once again, Milo led the way as he negotiated a series of narrow, twisting alleyways and advanced further into the castle's interior. My companion knew the way, and so I assumed he'd been here before. But Milo was clearly far from comfortable in this environment, his cool composure now gone as he frantically darted from shadow to shadow in an attempt to remain unseen. I followed his footsteps, noting how the rain had become even heavier, to the point where it physically hurt when it hit my skin. The storm was closer now too, with the din of thunder near deafening and the lightning temporarily illuminating the tight alleyways before they returned to darkness. I occasionally glanced upwards at the foreboding tower which dominated the skyline, but I couldn't bear to look upon it for long. I could only hope that the evil which dwelled within was incapable of leaving, but the intensity of the weather and urgency of Milo's actions were concerning to say the least. But before long, we emerged into an avenue at the foot of the tower and witnessed a horrifying scene. As the rain poured down, a line of lost souls trudged grimly through the puddles, clad in soaked rags. Their feet were bare and bodies emaciated. All their heads were down, and not one of the damned souls spoke or even acknowledged our presence in their hell. There was an obvious difference between this and the one I'd previously experienced. All of the souls were moving constantly, albeit slowly, but they were literally going nowhere. The damned slowly walked the cobblestones of one side of the street before reaching the end of the cul-de-sac, at which point they turned around and walked down the other side, turning again before repeating the process. They were walking in a circle and seemed to have been doing so for a long time. The waterlogged cobblestone street was surrounded on three sides by stone houses with open, glassless windows. At the far end, dominating the entire avenue, was the round tower, home to God knows what. I shouldn't have done so, but I cracked my head upwards, looking to the flame burning on the top story of the tower. I only looked for a second, but observed a dark figure staring down at me. Its appearance was little more than a shadow set against a burning torch, but the mere sight of this entity provoked a chilling, primal terror deep within me. A fear which paralyzed me until Milo shook me back to reality, forcing me to look away.
Don't do that!
He screamed frantically, his eyes filled with something close to madness.
Don't look at it! Not even for a moment!
We joined the line, pushing in between two damned souls who did not object, but as we passed by the row of stone houses, we bore witness to the true horror. Inside each small stone house, visible and exposed through the open windows, were blood-stained torture chambers filled with screaming, moaning victims. I saw naked bodies strung up by chains, strapped down to racks, and forced into iron maidens and other vile torture devices. And the torturers were foul demons, snarling, pale-skinned humanoids with hateful eyes and sharp claws that they gleefully used to slice into flesh and bone, cutting deep into their screaming victims without even a hint of mercy. I looked into the bloodshot eyes of the torture victims and saw nothing but pain, fear, and madness. I thought about trying to help them, but knew I couldn't. Milo had been clear on this, and so I looked away, trying in vain to ignore the screams and the awful sound of claws cutting through flesh. We joined the grim procession under the heavy rain as the thunderstorm closed in around us. We walked around in a circle 5 times, my nerves on edge as I felt myself slip to the edge of madness. I wondered why the others continued this endless, pointless march, but then I discovered why. Suddenly, just in front of us, one of the damned collapsed, crying out as he dropped to his knees.
I can't take it anymore!
He screamed whilst looking up into the storm clouds, but there was no mercy in this realm. The line was held up behind him, but not for long. I saw a burst of movement in the corner of my eye, turning in time to see a demon reaching out through the open window and grabbing hold of the man, digging its claws deep into his flesh.
No, please, God, no!
The victim screamed, but it was over quickly. The demon dragged the screaming man, pulling him through the window and into the torture chamber, where he would surely join the other victims in eternal torment. Not a single soul in the line had attempted to save him. In fact, the damned didn't even react to his abduction. They simply walked on as if nothing had happened, trudging through the puddles with their heads down. At this point, I saw this place for the hell it was. The first line I'd walked was terrifying and violent, but there was still hope in that realm. Rightly or wrongly, those trapped there believed they could escape and reach a better place. But there was no hope in this line. Here, the damned walked in circles for all eternity without any chance of escape. They did so because the alternative was even worse. Those who fell would be dragged from the line and tortured by demons lurking inside the stone houses, subjected to pain and terror until madness overcame them. My heart sank and I felt sick to my stomach. I now knew what this place was, but didn't understand what we were doing here. I put my hand on Milo's shoulder, making him turn his head as I said into his ear, "What the hell is this? You said we were here for Sally."
We are. Just wait.
I was frustrated by yet another evasive answer, but trusted Milo nonetheless. It was on our 13th circle of the street that the door suddenly shot open. I saw the entrance at the far end of the avenue, noting how it was the only house on the street without windows, meaning we were unable to see whatever horrors occurred inside. I experienced a grim foreboding as we walked towards the dim candlelight coming from the tiny house. But on some level, I knew that my destiny lay on the other side of that door. Whatever horror was inside was something I needed to face. The room we entered seemed comfortable at first. I was relieved to find sanctuary from the deluge. The smell inside was musky, but a vast improvement on the stinking corpses from the lake. The walls were bare, but there was an open fire burning in the corner, and I savored the warmth it provided. But what little comfort I felt was short-lived, because what we saw inside of that small room shook me to my very core. I spotted Milo staring blankly at the far corner of the room and slowly turned to face in that direction. My jaw dropped when I saw the woman sitting in a rocking chair, swinging back and forth whilst cradling a sobbing baby. Not a newborn, but a toddler, aged about 1 or 1.5. I recognized the young woman straight away. It was Sally, the girl I'd once loved. I called out her name, but she did not respond. It was like she didn't even know we were there. Sally's brunette hair was tied back in a ponytail. Her face was drawn, and there were bags underneath her eyes. She looked exhausted, and yet her green eyes were full of joy and happiness as she comforted the child, singing a sweet lullaby as she gently rocked him back and forth. I looked down at the baby boy in Sally's arms, and something clicked in my brain, but I still couldn't quite put the pieces together. I was desperately trying to think, but then a heartbreaking tragedy unfolded in front of my eyes. In a matter of seconds, the toddler's face drained of all color. His skin turned pale and then gray before his tiny body dissolved into ash, literally falling apart in Sally's arms. But the true horror was my ex-girlfriend's reaction. As Sally's world ended, she cried out the child's name as she collapsed to the floor.
Kevin! My baby boy! What have they done to you?
I saw the expression in her eyes turn from joy to devastation in a moment, and it was horrific. But what happened next was somehow even worse. In the blink of an eye, the previous scene was restored, as Kevin was brought back to life with Sally cradling him in her arms. She seemed to have no memory of the previous events, continuing to sing gently to the child while still ignoring the presence of Milo and me. But then the tragedy played out again, with Kevin disappearing into ash while Sally cried out in pain. It was clear she was trapped in an eternal loop. This was her torture, to see the child under her care die in her arms over and over again, until she was eventually driven mad with grief. This was Sally's hell. The terrible truth should have been obvious, but still my brain couldn't quite connect the dots. There was a heavy roar of thunder from outside the open door, which made me jump. The storm was right on top of us now, with the damned barely able to stand, let alone walk under the heavy wind and rain.
I don't understand. Why is this happening?
I asked whilst looking at Milo. My companion lost all patience at this point, grabbing me roughly by the shoulders and shaking me vigorously as he screamed in my face.
For God's sake, Joshua! We don't have time for this! Look at the child's face! Really look and you'll see the truth!
I did so, focusing on the boy's deep blue eyes, which were almost identical to my own, and then it finally clicked. A wave of emotions and memories came flooding back, and I remembered the painful truth. Kevin was my son. Sally had left me 2 years before. Our relationship couldn't survive the shared guilt over Milo's death. She'd moved to the other side of the country and broke off all contact. The breakup was devastating for me at the time, but I did try to move on with my life. What I didn't know was that Sally was carrying my child, a son I would never meet. I now remembered the phone call I received from Sally's father one rainy afternoon. I could tell from the tone in his voice that it was bad news. Sally was dead, killed instantly when her car was hit at the intersection by a long-haul truck driver who had fallen asleep at the wheel. She was killed instantly, as was Kevin, who was sitting in the child's seat in the back. I attended the funeral, barely functioning as tears rolled down my cheeks, and I watched the 2 coffins being lowered into the ground, mother and son put to rest together. My grief was shared by Sally's parents, family, and friends, but I also felt an unbearable guilt, because I knew that Sally and Kevin would still be alive if it wasn't for the terrible mistake I'd made 2 years before. My life spiraled out of control immediately after the funeral. I started drinking again in an attempt to dull the pain, but it wasn't enough. I was plagued by nightmares of the accident that night, and of Sally and Kevin's terrifying final moments. I couldn't take it any longer. I did get into my car that night, but didn't drive anywhere. The garage door was sealed shut when I turned on the engine, closing my eyes and allowing the toxic fumes to enter my lungs. I lost consciousness and slipped into eternal darkness, waking to find myself standing in the line with almost no memory of the events which led to my death. I'd assumed Sally was lying when she spoke about our son, but this was only because I could not remember, as perhaps my brain had blocked out the trauma. Sally had changed some details, or perhaps her own memory was fuzzy, but now I could see her love for Kevin was genuine, and her grief at losing him was devastating. I was still trying to process this revelation when my attention was drawn to the outside. Suddenly, a powerful bolt of lightning struck the street directly outside. The bolt was so bright that it temporarily blinded me, and the impact shattered the cobblestones, breaking the ground wide open as a deep crevice emerged, quickly expanding in size as screaming souls fell inside, plummeting down into the darkness. The buildings on each side of the street began to collapse as huge cracks grew, coming ever closer to the house we occupied while swallowing up everything in its path. Milo grabbed my arm so tightly that it hurt, and he screamed in my ear loud enough that it could be heard over the chaos.
It's now or never, Joshua! You need to get through to her! Do it now, or we're all screwed!
I nodded my head, taking a deep breath as I turned to face her. Sally was oblivious to all the chaos occurring around her, continuing to rock and sing to Kevin even as the whole world collapsed down upon our heads. Sally should have been dealt with delicately, but there was no time for this. I grabbed her roughly by the shoulders, shaking her until she acknowledged my presence. She cried out whilst grasping a tighter hold of Kevin, pulling him closer to her. She took a moment to recognize me, as my sudden appearance in her world was entirely unexpected.
Joshua.
She muttered weakly.
Josh? Is it really you?
I bit my lip, attempting to ignore the turmoil outside the door as I tried desperately to bring my ex back to reality.
Yeah, Sally, it's me. Now listen.
Josh.
She interjected, still oblivious to the situation developing around her.
So sorry, Josh. I should have told you the truth. Thought I was doing the right thing, but I was wrong.
She paused, looking down at the still crying toddler in her arms.
Josh, this is my son. A beautiful baby boy.
Masonry and debris were falling from the ceiling above us, and Milo was screaming in my ear. I had run out of time.
Sally, that is not our son.
She opened her mouth in dismay, replying angrily through trembling lips.
How dare you, Joshua? How dare you say that?
Sally, we have a son, but that's not him. This is all a trick. You need to snap out of it right now.
Screw you!
She swore whilst tightening her grip on the baby. I'd reached the end of my tether and decided that direct action was required. It broke my heart, but there was no other choice. I reached out, grabbing at Kevin and pulling with all my strength. She reacted predictably, crying out as she desperately fought against me.
No! What are you doing? Let go!
But I couldn't do this. The struggle lasted mere seconds, but it seemed like an eternity. Sally fought with all her strength, but I was able to pry the baby from her arms, although her maternal screams brought a chill down my spine. I held Kevin in my arms for a brief moment before his skin went gray and his tiny body turned to ash, slipping through my fingers and falling to the ground. This event finally woke Sally from her trance, her eyes widening as she surveyed her surroundings.
What the hell? Where am I?
Then she looked to the doorway and her face froze with horror.
Oh my god.
I turned my head and saw what she meant. The street outside had now vanished, falling into the ever-expanding sinkhole which was swallowing up everything in its path, and the small room we occupied was collapsing around us, the ground shaking as we dodged huge slabs falling from the ceiling. I looked into Milo's eyes and saw nothing but blind terror. I'd completed the task assigned to me, but was it already too late? We all feared the worst as the storm raged and the earth cracked open, but suddenly I felt an intense heat on my back. Turning around, I saw a swirling vortex of blood red, identical to the one I'd been sucked into during my previous test.
Thank God!
Milo exclaimed as he darted forward, leaping into the portal without a second thought. I went to follow, knowing whatever lay on the far side was surely better than here, but when I glanced across at Sally, I saw she was frozen to the spot, staring into the vortex with terror in her eyes.
I can't do this.
Yes, you can! I shot back whilst grabbing hold of her hand and shooting her a reassuring smile. We'll go together. She smiled back at me, and then we were running hand in hand, entering the vortex seconds before the ground collapsed. And then, darkness consumed us. We're in a different place now. Not heaven or hell, but another version of purgatory, where we must remain until our sins are absolved. This prison takes form of a run-down apartment block set in the middle of a dark, monster-riddled hellscape. We are sealed inside of the building, and so are reasonably safe. Sally, Milo, and I are still bound together, forced to live in this tiny apartment. Our neighbors are a motley crew of bizarre individuals, all serving their own sentences for various sins committed in the mortal realm. The block warden is an odd man, helpful and friendly up to a point, although I sense a deep sadness in him and suspect he is on his own journey of redemption. This isn't a pleasant place to inhabit, and the three of us are often at each other's throats, but in a strange way, we three are like family now. And as bad as this complex can be, we know there are far worse realms we could be sent to. The Shadow Man continues to oversee us, communicating very occasionally through a one-way telephone installed in our apartment. We know there's still time to be served, and we're all willing to do so, if only because we have hope for the future. We may be dead, but we still have dreams. Milo is waiting for the wife he left behind, looking forward to their eventual reunion. As for Sally and me, our goal is to find our baby boy, to reach whatever level of the afterlife his innocent soul inhabits. When that day comes, we'll become the family we always should have been, and our past sins will be swept away.
My name is Joshua, or Josh for short, and I'm dead. It took me a while to come to this realization and to recall the circumstances around my death. It wasn't easy facing up to the truth. Some of you might be familiar with my story if you've heard my previous accounts. If not, I guess it's pretty simple, really. I made a terrible mistake, people suffered as a result, and I had to pay the price. I wasn't sent to hell. I could well have ended up there, so I suppose I should count myself lucky. My temporary home was a crumbling and decrepit apartment building inhabited by a motley crew of bizarre individuals. This wasn't hell, but I guess it was some kind of purgatory. Every one of my neighbors was dead, and we all had our stories to tell. The complex we were trapped inside was anything but pleasant. Still, compared to what sat beyond our walls, the building was a sanctuary. Nobody ever stepped outside of our building. Some had tried in the past, from what I'm told, but it never ended well. The outside was eternal night, nothing except darkness under a ghostly pale orb. Our building was surrounded by a shadowland inhabited by unspeakable monsters and sadistic demons. As bad as it was in there, the outside was far worse. And I should know, because I had already seen these vile creatures in action. But to be honest, I thought little of the hellscape after we first arrived in this realm, because I wasn't alone in there. there were 3 of us living inside of this small and squalid apartment. 3 souls tied together in death, for better or for worse. Sally is my ex-girlfriend. More than that, actually. She's the mother of my child, but I didn't discover I was a father until it was nearly too late. My second roommate was Milo, the man who I'd killed in a drunk driving accident prior to my own death. I'd never faced justice for this crime on Earth, because Sally and I conspired to cover up Milo's death. It's pretty messed up, right? The 3 of us had been through a lot together, having literally fought through hell side by side. Still, the close confinement, boredom, and constant stress and anxiety gets to you in such a place. I don't know how long we'd been inside before the tension started to get to us. It was difficult to keep track of time in that realm. All I know is that the arguments became more frequent between the 3 of us, and we had few friends in this realm. 3 of us were newcomers in their home, and we weren't trusted. The block warden was a man called Marcus. He did his best to keep the peace, but it was a tough job, and I could see him fast approaching the breaking point. I watched this poor guy with his sullen eyes and pasty skin and wondered what hell he'd lived through to arrive in this place. But whatever his story was, Marcus wasn't for sharing. I vividly remember the night when the first incident occurred. There was something foul in the air that night, the stench even worse than the black mold which infested the building. I remember having this foreboding feeling as I lay on the hard mattress, staring up at the ceiling as I struggled to get some sleep. Sally lay beside me in the dark. She had nodded off about an hour before, although she remained restless, talking incoherently in her sleep as the nightmares invaded her subconscious. I didn't know what was going through her mind, but could hazard a guess. Our son was lost somewhere out there, on his own in an unknown level of the afterlife. Our boy had died alongside his mother in a freak car accident. I had never even met our son, but still, it pained me to think of him all alone. But I could only imagine what Sally was going through. For a mother to be separated from her infant child, I can't imagine a worse hell. I watched Sally suffer in her sleep for a while, covering her with a blanket and kissing her gently on the forehead. We weren't back together, and our relationship in there wasn't romantic. I felt no physical desire for her, and don't think it was possible to do so in that purgatory. But the love we'd once shared, those feelings hadn't gone away, even after death. I didn't think I could sleep that night, but finally I did drop off due to sheer exhaustion, but my slumber was anything but peaceful. Nightmarish visions invaded my dreams as suddenly I was back in the line, surrounded by snarling demons and trapped between heaven and hell. And then I was returned to the car, sealed in at the bottom of that damned lake as I smashed my fists against the windscreen in a futile attempt to break out. Once again, I was mesmerized by the dark water surrounding me, but terrified by the wide-eyed predators which swam in rings around my sunken vehicle. Nightmares such as these were all too common, unfortunately. But what followed next was a terrifying first. I shot up from the mattress, gasping in air as my whole body dripped with cold sweat. I'd awoken suddenly in a state of acute panic, but couldn't say why. Disturbances were more a frequent occurrence in this building, with bumps in the night happening around the clock, but this was something else. All my senses were heightened as I adjusted my eyes to the dark room, surveying my surroundings, but finding nothing out of place. I listened intently, but could hear nothing except for Sally's soft snores. All seemed in order, but still, I could tell something wasn't right. Call it a sixth sense, but I knew there was a threat I had to face. I looked to Sally and saw she was still asleep. I didn't want to wake her, so I got up carefully and quietly as I made my way to the bedroom door. Milo was sleeping on the hard couch in the living room, rolling over in discomfort as I passed him. I looked down upon Milo for a moment and felt a mixture of emotions. Life would be a lot easier if Milo wasn't here, but Sally and I owed him a massive debt. He said he'd forgiven us for taking his mortal life, but as time went on, I wondered. I saw the look he shot Sally and me and noted all the times he'd snapped at us. Frankly, who could blame Milo for holding a grudge? But there was more to it. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but I reckon Milo was hiding something from us. He rarely spoke about his mortal existence, other than the occasional references to his wife. Sometimes I wondered whether Milo really was just a random hit-and-run victim. But our roommate posed no threat on this night, as he remained fast asleep. I scanned the living room and saw nothing out of the ordinary. Perhaps I was just being paranoid. But no, I had to trust my instincts. Slowly but surely, I made my way across the living room floor and reached out for the ragged curtain covering the window. With considerable reluctance, I drew back the curtain, only to recoil in terror at what I saw. On the far side of the thin glass, staring in at me, was a huge eye, its white sclera a good 3 foot in diameter, and the black pupil as large as a dinner plate. I gasped, covering my mouth with my hand to prevent myself from screaming. The horrifying giant eyeball took up most of the window, and I was unable to see the full form of the gigantic monster it belonged to. I don't know whether I was paralyzed in fear or trapped under the beast's wicked spell, but I couldn't move from the spot or avert my eyes from the demonic eye. It didn't blink or move, but I knew the beast was watching me. Surely a creature of this size could break through the window with ease, and yet it didn't. It just stared for I don't know how long. There's no telling how it would have ended, but suddenly I heard movement behind me, turning in time to see Milo rising from his slumber. I could only watch as my companion adjusted to his surroundings and saw the giant eye staring in at him.
What the hell?
He cried in disbelief. This prompted the beast to react as it let out a banshee-like wail so loud it drowned out all other sounds. I fell to my knees and covered my ears in a vain attempt to drown out the horrific din. There were footsteps behind me, and I saw Sally out of the corner of my eye, her face filled with pure terror. My attention remained on the window as the monster's foul wailing ended. I expected it to attack, but mercifully this didn't happen. Instead, the beast seemed to be spooked, since it retreated from the window and fled back into the Shadowlands. Against my better judgment, I darted forward in hope of getting a decent look at the peeping monster. In truth, I could make out little in the darkness, but the beast had the shape of a giant bird with a long and sharp beak and unnaturally large eyes. It retreated awkwardly across the dead ground upon long, stalk-like legs, which looked too thin and flimsy to carry its weight. Nevertheless, the beast moved quickly and soon disappeared into the darkness, leaving no trace of its unwelcome visit. I turned back towards Milo and Sally, all 3 of us in a state of shock and unable to utter a single word. I met with Marcus the next day. I suppose it would have been morning, except the sun never rose in this hellscape. The block warden was anxious. I could tell as much as soon as I saw him. We met under the dim strip lights in the staircase, whispering in the shadows so not to be overheard by the other residents. Marcus smoked like a chimney, looking over his shoulder nervously as he listened to my account. I noted the heavy bags under his eyes and reckoned the poor man must have slept for some time. Perhaps he wasn't permitted to ever rest in this hellish realm. I certainly didn't envy the job he had in there, and reckoned it must have taken a toll on his sanity. Nevertheless, I told Marcus my story, describing the encounter with the saucer-eyed beast who'd stared into our apartment window. Marcus didn't comment as he listened intently whilst nodding his head solemnly. There was a lengthy pause after I finished giving my account, as it appeared Marcus was deep in thought. In the end, I had to prompt him. "Well, what do you think?" Marcus looked me in the eye, and I saw the pain and suffering he carried with him. He sighed deeply before eventually replying.
This has always been a pretty weird place, Joshua. There's always an underlying danger and threat in the block, but there were also rules. I kept the peace as best as I could, and we survived, always waiting for the end of our respective sentences. Ours was a tough life, but it was just about survivable.
"So, what's your point?" I interjected impatiently. Marcus shot me a look, clearly angered by the interruption. I should have known better than to provoke a man on the edge.
My point is, things are changing around here. The creatures who stalk the Shadowlands, they've always been out there, but they never came close to our building. That's all changed now, as you've witnessed.
Marcus lowered his head and broke off eye contact before continuing in a little more than a whisper.
And there's been other incidents too. Shadowy figures walking the corridors, packs of harpies attacking the wire mesh, pale-skinned demons jumping over the rooftops. This isn't a safe place anymore, Joshua. I don't know how long I can keep it together.
I felt a cold chill run through me as the terrifying reality hit home. I don't understand. What has changed? Why is this happening? Marcus raised his head, his lips forming into a half grin as he answered.
You did. You and your 2 friends arrived, and suddenly the whole place went to hell. If you'll excuse the pun.
I ignored Marcus's attempt at dark humor, feeling incredulous at his accusation. You think we're responsible for all this? I exclaimed defensively. Marcus shook his head.
Not me, but the others are talking. They're scared and want somebody to blame. For what it's worth, I'm trying to talk them down.
He paused briefly, looking over his shoulder once again before he next spoke.
I can hold them back for now, but if there's another incident, some of the residents are genuinely dangerous. Hastings, Dr. Marshall, just watch your back, Joshua. That's all I'm saying.
My anger subsided somewhat when I realized Marcus was actually trying to help us. I was still scared, of course, but at least Marcus had given me the heads up. I held out my hand for the block warden to shake, a small act to show my appreciation. Marcus seemed shocked by the gesture, staring at my extended hand in puzzlement for a moment, but finally he shook, and I noted how his palm was ice cold. Marcus went to leave, but I still felt I owed him one. I placed a hand on his shoulder as he turned, watching him flinch at my touch. "Hey man, are you doing okay?" I asked sympathetically. Marcus didn't meet my eye, however, pulling away and continuing up the staircase.
Yeah, I'm fine. I'm just having some trouble with my TV reception.
I didn't know what he meant, but Marcus wouldn't elaborate as he disappeared up the stairs and retreated into his apartment. As it happened, we didn't have to wait for long until the next incident inside the building. The crisis which brought it all tumbling down. The three of us were sitting down to have a meal at the small dining table in our living room. This was Sally's idea. It was a ritual more than anything else. We were dead, and so didn't need to eat. And the slop we had in front of us was from a can, and was far from appetizing. I played with the gruel on my spoon, not wanting to put it in my mouth, but then I glanced across the table and saw disapproval in Sally's eyes. I'd seen that look before. This was important to her, and so I needed to play along. So I lifted my spoon up to my lips, placing the food inside my mouth before I started to chew. Sally smiled with satisfaction as she took a spoonful from her own bowl.
"This is nice,"
she said, rather unconvincingly.
"It's good to get back to some normality."
I smiled and nodded, not wanting to break the illusion. But Milo wasn't playing ball. He scoffed in contempt, spitting out his food and dropping the spoon down on the table with a heavy thud.
"Remember your table manners."
Are you kidding me, lady? You really think we could play happy families in here after everything that's happened? Are you crazy?
Milo shot back angrily. I opened my mouth to respond, but Sally beat me to it.
"I know it's rough in here. We're all hurting, but we've got to make the best of it."
Milo shook his head in disgust, and I could tell he wouldn't back down. He glared at Sally, then at me, holding my gaze with hatred in his eyes as he snarled through clenched teeth.
You know, I thought I could forgive and forget what you both did to me. But I didn't think those sick bastards would stick me in here for the rest of eternity, trapped with the same assholes who killed me. Call me old-fashioned, but I don't want to break bread with my murderers!
I lost my head at this point, shouting as I stood up from my chair. "Damn it, Milo! How many times? It was an accident!" Milo stood up then, and so did Sally. We were all screaming at each other in a blazing row. I reckon it might have come to blows, but we had far more to worry about than domestic squabbles. Suddenly, the temperature in the room dropped dramatically, going from stifling heat to ice cold in mere seconds. I saw the instant change in Sally and Milo, their eyes widening in all too familiar terror as both looked over their shoulder. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end as I slowly turned my head, only to come face to face with a monster sitting upon our worn-out couch. My eyes bulged and jaw dropped. I surveyed the beast who inexplicably invaded our sanctuary. The demon was the size and shape of a fully grown man, but it certainly wasn't human. The genderless creature was perhaps 6 feet tall in height, its skin a deadly shade of pale white. Its fingers were unnaturally long, and its nails were formed into razor-sharp talons. The demon's eyes were jet black and soulless, but the smile on its crusty lips was anything but friendly. It shot us a sadistic grin which showed off its rotten, yellowed teeth, but its stare was truly terrifying. A killer's gaze through dark and shark-like eyes. I was frozen in terror for a long moment, wondering if my eyes were playing tricks on me, but no, this couldn't be, because Sally and Milo could see it too. I didn't know what to do, but suddenly I felt a firm hand on my shoulder as Milo whispered in my ear.
Don't look at it. Don't react to its presence. It feeds off our fear. Ignore the bastard and it'll leave.
Milo's instructions sounded crazy to me, but he had more experience with these demons than I did, so I decided to trust him. Against all my instincts, I turned my back on the monster, once again facing the table and my now terrified companions. I could hardly breathe as I felt the beast's hard gaze on the back of my head.
Just pretend like everything's normal.
I looked at our companion in astonishment, but he met me with a stern look.
Everything is normal.
He repeated. Next, I glanced across at Sally and was alarmed to see her shaking almost uncontrollably. Her skin turned as pale as milk. I didn't know how we'd get through this, but Milo was taking charge.
You know, I was wrong, Sally. This is a good idea. Nothing quite beats a sit-down family dinner.
With that said, Milo took a spoonful of gruel and put it into his mouth. This actually brought a smile to Sally's lips, even though her eyes were still filled with terror. I wondered whether Milo's insane plan might actually work, but then I heard the low guttural growl from behind me, closely followed by the sound of claw-like talons clicking on the hard wooden floor. The sweat poured down from my brow as I listened to the demon walking across our apartment floor. I couldn't see the beast, but knew it was slowly marching towards our table.
Don't turn around.
Milo whispered whilst retaining a fake smile on his trembling lips.
Don't look at it, and don't react, no matter what happens.
The demon was right behind me now. I could feel its hot breath on the back of my neck, and the foul stench it emitted filled my nostrils. It took everything I had in me, but I managed to keep my head down and avoid the monster's eyes as it circled the table. But Sally wasn't so lucky. She raised her head for just a moment, meeting the demon's hideous gaze for mere seconds. And that was all it took for the monster to latch onto her. I watched on in terror as the demon stood over her, extending its elongated fingers as it reached out to touch her cheek with its hideous talons. Sally was frozen in terror, her body trembling as tears rolled down her cheeks. This was more than I could stand as my protective instincts took over. I shot up from my seat. "Don't you dare touch her!" In an instant, the demon left Sally and it turned its attention to me, the sadistic grin widening as its dark eyes focused. The attack was so fast I couldn't react. It's all something of a blur in my memory, but I know the monster grabbed hold of me, its claws digging into my chest and making me scream in agony. The monster enjoyed my suffering as it snarled aggressively. It was so strong I couldn't resist. Before I knew it, my body was lifted off the ground and I was flung across the room like a rag doll, collapsing to the wood floor as the force of impact knocked the wind out of me. Sally screamed and Milo jumped up from his chair, but there was nothing they could do for me as the demon approached, its maw open and talons outstretched as it pressed the attack. I thought I was a goner. But just then, I heard a crashing sound coming from the hallway as our front door was kicked in. Heavy boots followed, and a moment later, 2 armed men piled into the room, weapons at the ready. I looked up and recognized my neighbors coming to the rescue. Marcus was armed with a double-barrel shotgun, while Hastings carried his trusty crossbow. Both men had a fiery determination in their eyes, only hesitating for a moment as the beast snarled aggressively in their direction. Hastings fired first, shooting a bolt into the demon's shoulder. It howled in pain but didn't go down, prompting Marcus to empty both barrels into the beast's torso. The din of gunfire was near deafening and the gun smoke filled the room. The beast was flung backwards, its hide pierced by buckshot. It fell against the wall, and for a moment I hoped it was dead, but no such luck. Our enemy was hurt but still moving. Cornered and scared, it dashed forward towards the door. Marcus and Hastings just managed to jump out of the way as the monster tore past them, fleeing into the corridor and out the front door. Marcus and Hastings promptly reloaded before chasing after the beast. Meanwhile, Milo and Sally ran to my side and helped me to my feet, and the 3 of us followed our armed neighbors out onto the balcony. We ran out just in time to see the demon leap upwards with tremendous speed and power. Looking up, I saw our attacker smashing through the thin wire mesh which separated our inner courtyard from the dark skies above, making a heavy footfall as it tore across the tiles. Our neighbors opened fire, but the demon was too fast, and soon it leapt off the building and disappeared into the dark abyss of the Shadowlands, making good its escape. We survived the demon's assault, but only by the skin of our teeth. The ruckus and gunfire had alerted our other neighbors, as one by one the apartment doors shot open and a motley assortment of frightened and angry souls stepped out onto the balconies and courtyard below. Most of our neighbors were present. Widow Jackson sheepishly poked her nose out of her door, forever nervous and on edge as her eyes scanned the balcony, and Mr. Jones was on the ground floor, looking more curious than anything. But that damn dog was with him, fighting against the leash as it barked maniacally up at the dark sky above. Cerberus was the mutt's name, and his owner called him a pet, but Jones's animal was the size of a large wolf and definitely not domesticated. And there was Dr. Marshall, who sauntered out of his front door and onto the balcony across from us. blood on his shirt as his dark eyes surveyed the scene with a predatory zeal. It chilled me to look upon the so-called doctor. I didn't know exactly what he did inside of his apartment with those special deliveries from management, but the foul smell of his apartment and the blood that seeped through the ceiling told a story. There were others too, neighbors who kept to themselves in this hellhole, just more lost souls serving their sentences for undisclosed sins. I scanned their faces and saw nothing but stress and fear. It seemed the entire community was on edge and one incident away from the breaking point. It was Hastings who spoke first, turning towards the three of us with anger evident in his cold eyes.
You damn people! You brought the trouble with you!
What the hell are you on about?
Sally shot back in confusion.
I'm afraid he is right, dear,
said Marshall.
These disturbances have only increased in frequency and severity since the arrival of your group.
There were murmurs of agreement from the other residents, as I could tell the crowd was turning against us. Marcus tried to argue in our defense, setting his shotgun down against the railings as he raised his hands defensively.
Come on, guys,
he said in a less than convincing manner.
This isn't the way we do things in here.
Things have changed,
Hastings said firmly, his hands still firmly clutching hold of his crossbow.
What do you suggest we do?
Marcus asked nervously.
Cast them out,
came the cry from Marshall.
Let them take their chances in the Shadowlands.
You can't be serious!
Milo shouted back, but the mob was rapidly turning against us. I looked to my companions and saw the shock and terror in their eyes. Marcus went for his gun, but Hastings pulled the crossbow on him.
Don't do it, old friend. You need to let this happen.
The crowd started to move menacingly along the balconies towards us. The three of us backed off fearfully. I thought we could seal ourselves inside the apartment, but didn't think we'd last for long. Marcus continued to try and talk the mob down, but a moment later, his eyes were drawn upward. I saw the warden's face turn even paler and wondered what had spooked him.
Dear God,
he said whilst pointing upwards.
Look.
Hastings grinned insanely as he continued to aim his crossbow directly at the warden's chest.
Come on, man. Do you really expect me to fall for that?
But Hastings should have listened. I heard the sound of scratching and tearing followed by a high-pitched shriek of something terrifying. Glancing up, I saw a red-scaled and winged monster crawling along the wire mesh and heading straight to the newly created hole in our thin protection. Its dark eyes lit up and its maw opened to reveal the sharp teeth within. Hastings heard the shriek and reacted quickly, but it was already too late. He managed to fire a single bolt high and wide before the bloodthirsty harpy dived on top of him, burying its claws and teeth into his body. The man screamed and struggled, but the winged demon used its immense strength to lift him off the balcony, still gripping a tight hold of its victim as it ascended with wings outstretched. Soon exiting through the same gap it had entered and soaring into the starless sky, taking the still screaming Hastings with it. We were all frozen for a moment, in shock. Our previous disputes forgotten as we faced this new and deadly threat, and the attack was just beginning. Harpies always hunted in packs, and many more followed the initial incursion, using the gaping hole in the wire to gain access. The apartment complex was no longer safe, and all hell was about to break loose. Terrified residents attempted to flee back into their apartments, but few made it that far, as the winged demons descended upon them, literally tearing their victims to shreds in a bloody slaughter. Chaos ensued as several things happened at once. There was a series of loud bangs from inside Widow Jackson's apartment. The woman screamed as she ran back into her apartment. At the same time, a trio of harpies launched a brutal attack upon Mr. Jones, but Cerberus was there to protect his master. The wolf leapt into the path of the first demon, biting deep into its throat with all the fury of hell. The harpy shrieked in agony as the two beasts struggled on the ground, but the demon bled out within seconds. Meanwhile, the other two harpies attacked Mr. Jones, grabbing him by the arms as he screamed and struggled. Cerberus wasn't done fighting for his master, though, as he leapt upon the second demon and tore at its wings. But it was too late for Jones, as the final harpy took hold of him, digging its claws deep before ascending. Cerberus barked desperately as he watched his master being taken, but the slaughter continued unabated. My attention was drawn back to Widow Jackson's apartment as a huge man charged out onto the balcony, screaming maniacally as his wild eyes scanned the courtyard below. He must have been 6 foot 6 inches tall and heavily built too. I noted how he wore childlike pajamas, which were several sizes too small for him, giving the man an almost comical appearance. I assumed this was Widow Jackson's errant son, Johnny, who had been confined to his bedroom until now. The man-child saw the demons feasting upon the neighbors and panicked, sprinting heavily along the balcony and heading for the staircase. Miss Jackson chased after her son, shouting his name frantically as she went, but sadly, the long-suffering woman didn't make it far as a harpy descended upon her from above and pulled the shrieking lady upward into a rapid and merciless attack. Events continued to move quickly as a pair of bloodthirsty harpies flew towards us, their vast wings flapping whilst their dark eyes focused upon us. Their intended prey, luckily, Marcus, was alert to the danger, aiming a shotgun and firing twice. The buckshot tore through the winged demons, shooting them out of the sky. I watched with relief as the monsters fell down to the courtyard and reeled in agony on the cold ground below us. The imminent threat was neutralized, but we were far from safe, as the monsters picked off our neighbors one by one.
We need to get back inside,
Sally said.
No.
Marcus replied firmly.
We must get to the lobby. It's our only chance.
We followed the warden's lead, running for the staircase as Marcus reloaded his weapon. I tried my best to drown out the awful din of the victim's screams and demons biting into flesh, instead looking to Sally and taking her hand as we descended. We soon reached the dimly lit lobby with its cracked tiles and moldy walls. I don't know what Marcus had planned next, but the situation was still developing. Johnny was using all of his considerable might to beat against the inner door, eventually smashing through. He then proceeded to pound on the second reinforced door, which was all that now stood between us and the Shadowlands beyond. We watched as the strong man attempted to break out, but the door was too strong for him alone. Suddenly, we heard a growl and the ominous sound of something big tearing down the stairs behind us. We darted out of the way as Marcus raised his gun in anticipation of another attack, but it wasn't a harpy coming down the staircase. It was Cerberus. The huge dog ignored our party as it charged through the lobby and headed straight for the door. Cerberus struck the door with all his considerable weight, and the combined strength of the dog and Johnny forced it open. We were suddenly hit by a cold wind as our final defense from the Shadowlands was breached, and before we could do anything, both Johnny and Cerberus fled out into the darkness, heading in opposite directions. Marcus laid down his shotgun as he rushed forward, shouting something about barricading the entrance, but he stopped dead in his tracks when a figure emerged in the doorway, stepping out of the shadows so we could see his face under the flickering strip lights. I froze when I saw and recognized the entity who had shaped my journey through the afterlife. He might have been a ghoul, demon, or perhaps even an angel, with swirling vortexes in place of eyes, smiling menacingly as he stood in the doorway whilst wearing a full tuxedo and bow tie, thus appearing entirely out of place in this grim hellscape. I think all my companions knew who he was, Marcus included. I had never learnt the entity's true name and had simply christened him as the Dark Man. All I knew was that he held immense but not total power, but perhaps he could decide our ultimate fate. All four of us stood frozen to the spot as the Dark Man entered the lobby, the soles of his shoes clinking against the tiles as he came. At least I assumed there were only four of us, but I jumped in surprise upon hearing a familiar voice from behind us.
Ah, our patron. Such a pleasure to receive a visit from management.
I turned around and came face to face with Dr. Marshall. A thin and unnerving smile etched across his pasty cheeks. The doctor had somehow survived the massacre on the balconies, but my attention was drawn back to the Dark Man as he spoke out in a booming voice.
Gentlemen and lady, I'm glad to see you all made it through our latest test. Time is of the essence, so let me cut to the chase. This complex is no longer viable. You cannot stay here and must move on.
Move on.
You will leave through this very door and walk the Shadowlands.
Are you crazy? Those monsters out there, they'll kill us.
The Dark Man's grin widened, and he made a point of standing aside and pointing out into the darkness. And in front of our very eyes, two lines of white light lit up, a pathway leading through the Shadowlands and out towards the distant horizon. I felt a cold chill of deja vu as my mind was thrust back to the terror I'd experienced after death.
Some of you have faced this test before. The others will learn soon enough. It's simple, really. All you need to do is stay inside the white lines and walk. Nothing can hurt you as long as you stay within the lines. Keep on walking until the end of the line, and then you'll all face your final fate. There's nothing more to it.
Why should we? We've all suffered enough already. I don't want to play your games anymore.
The Dark Man didn't miss a beat as he calmly responded to Sally's outburst.
I'm afraid you don't have the choice, madam. This structure will cease to exist in the very near future. You must walk the line or face the Shadowlands without my protection. Believe it or not, I'm trying to help you.
Sally didn't have an answer to this. I heard her making that nervous clicking sound with her tongue, and this reminded me of our past life together. No one spoke in the tense moment which followed, and I believe we all made a collective decision. The dark man turned to leave, offering us a final piece of advice before he disappeared into the dark abyss.
Stay focused on your objective, stay in the lines, and work together. These are the rules that will see you through.
And with that, he stepped into the shadows and vanished without a trace. We all stood in the lobby for a long moment, speechless and unsure of ourselves. We knew what had to be done, but I think the four of us were reluctant to take the first step. But Dr. Marshall held no such inhibitions as he stepped forward with a spring in his step and spoke jovially.
Come on, folks. You heard the man. There's no time like the present.
To my astonishment, the twisted physician marched out into the dark wasteland without a hint of fear, acting like he was simply going for a stroll in the park. I shook my head, thinking that Marshall must be completely insane. Nevertheless, he had taken the lead, and we all had to follow. And so the four of us reluctantly stepped across the tiled floor and toward the doorway. I hesitated, as every instinct in my body told me not to step outside. In the end, it was Sally who persuaded me, taking my hand and shooting me a sweet smile that reminded me of better times. However, there was a steady determination in her eyes as she spoke.
We need to do this, Josh. It's our only chance of getting back to Kevin.
I thought of the son I'd never met, and the fact he was all alone out there, and this gave me strength. Sally stepped out first, and I followed. Milo was next out the door, and Marcus was the last to leave. We walked single file within the lines, trudging through mud as a cold crosswind hit us. We could see little beyond the light emitted by the lines, but still I glanced nervously into the dark abyss and feared what monstrosities might be lurking in the shadows. I guess we'd only walked a couple of 100 yards before the ground started to shake. Turning around in a panic, we saw the artificial lights in the ugly apartment block extinguishing all at once. A moment later, the building itself began to sink into the mud, collapsing under the ground as a massive sinkhole swallowed it up. Before long, there was nothing left, as the hole sealed itself and no trace remained of our former home. I can't say I was sorry to see the prison go, but I noticed how Marcus stood for a long moment, sighing deeply before he finally turned away and left the past behind him. Our walk was a long one, the tension and fear only increasing the farther we progressed. We could see virtually nothing in the darkness, as even the pale orb in the night sky was eclipsed. But we could hear them, the invisible monsters who ruled the Shadowlands. They knew we were intruding on their turf and would surely like nothing more than to rip our bodies to shreds and feed upon our entrails. The low growls and predatory roars came from all around us, but the hidden demons and unidentified entities couldn't get to us, as the line offered protection. Still, the creatures were surely following our progress. We could make out their dark shadows and hear their heavy hooves trudging through the mud. Like all predators, they were searching for weaknesses, for one of us to step out of line where we'd be exposed and vulnerable. But we kept our cool and obeyed the golden rule: stay inside the lines and keep walking. Our next test was more of a challenge, however. About halfway along the line, we heard a most unexpected and unnerving sound come from the shadows, one which brought a cold chill down my spine, but almost broke Sally. It was the noise of a baby crying somewhere off in the distance, faint at first, but growing even louder. Sally stopped dead in her tracks as her eyes widened and she listened intently.
Kevin!
She said, whispering at first, but raising her volume to a frantic cry.
Kevin! It's Mommy! I'm coming for you, baby!
I had to act quickly, reaching out and grabbing her just before she stepped over the line. She fought fiercely, but I retained my tight grip.
Let me go, Josh! That's our son in there!
No, it isn't! It's a trick, Sally. They're trying to draw us out. I guess she had to fight all her maternal instincts, but Sally finally listened to reason and stopped struggling. She continued to walk the line with the rest of us, quietly sobbing as Kevin's cries faded away. This was only the start of it, however, as our ears were assaulted by cries and pleas for help from the darkness. It seemed that whatever demonic entity was hunting us could mimic the voices and tones of our relatives and loved ones, attempting every trick in its repertoire to try and lure us out. We heeded the dark man's advice and ignored the ghoulish calls, but they took a heavy toll upon our collective sanity, 4 of us were evidently very distressed, but not Dr. Marshall. He seemed fascinated by the terrifying situation, looking out into the shadows with an almost childlike excitement, which I found very disturbing. The depression hit soon after. I felt the darkness creeping inside of me. A deep despair and guilt as every bad memory and negative emotion came flooding to the surface. I believe the others were affected in the same manner, and then the confessions began. The crime committed by Sally and I was already common knowledge, but Marcus let it all slip out as he tearfully recalled the accident which had resulted in the deaths of his wife and 2 daughters. They died in a house fire caused by a cigarette butt he'd carelessly dropped. The warden's story was tragic for sure, but I was more interested in Milo's confession as our companion finally opened up to us.
You never asked why I was walking on the roadside after dark. You know, the night you guys hit me.
He began solemnly. Sally and I both glanced back, although Milo would not meet our gaze.
I had a big fight with my wife and stormed out. Truth is, I treated her badly. I let her down.
I stopped walking and turned around to face my companion, feeling a renewed sympathy for the man we'd wronged. You made mistakes, Milo. It doesn't mean you deserve all this. A long pause followed before he next spoke.
There was more. I did some really bad things.
I was hooked by this point, temporarily ignoring the terror all around us as I waited for Milo to elaborate. But his confession was interrupted by Dr. Marshall, who called back along the line with his own unwanted story.
You know, folks, I never actually killed anyone during my mortal existence. All my experiments were conducted on the recently deceased. I was caught in the act, and that was the end of my medical training. Things spiraled out of control, and sadly, an opioid addiction ended my life. I always believed I was on the cusp of greatness. That's what was robbed from me.
Nobody had any response to the doctor's disturbing admission, and I was annoyed by the interruption, because Milo had lost his nerve and he wouldn't reveal the full context of his sins. I don't know how long we'd been walking for, but it seemed like miles trekked along the seemingly endless line. The voices stopped, and even the depression lifted. We were all physically and mentally exhausted, but I dared to hope the worst was behind us. Unfortunately, the next threat was not one I'd anticipated. Dr. Marshall was still leading the march at the front of the line, until suddenly he stopped dead in his tracks, turning slowly to confront us. I saw his face illuminated by the white lines and was chilled by the sadistic grin on his lips and the dark intensity in his wide eyes. Sally stood between Marshall and me, but I instinctively pushed past her and put myself between her and the doctor. "What are you doing, Marshall?" I asked nervously. He chuckled dryly before offering a cryptic answer, and the look on his face was one of pure madness.
I hear them speaking to me, calling out from the shadows. They say I can be with them, that they'll show me wonders beyond human imagination and allow me to reach my full potential. They'll give me everything I've always wanted. And all they need in return is a sacrifice.
I tensed up as I realized that danger was imminent, but Marshall moved much faster than I could have imagined. He struck me with a hard punch, and I went down, my nose bleeding as a sharp pain shot through my skull. I landed in the mud as Marshall leapt over me and grabbed hold of Sally, using his arm to place her in a tight headlock. Next, Milo shot forward and attempted to save her, but Marshall lashed out and pushed him away. I fought through the pain and pulled myself up, but Marshall had already stepped out into the darkness. I went to chase after him, but Sally called out to stop me.
You have to go, Josh! Go to Kevin! He needs you!
I stood frozen in shock as the woman I'd once loved was dragged into the darkness, and both soon disappeared into the great unknown.
"Get up! It's coming for you!"
Came the sudden cry. That was Marcus, but his warning wasn't directed towards me. I looked over to Milo, who lay in the mud where he'd fallen, only to realize he was outside of the lines. Milo tried to crawl back, but it was already too late. Suddenly, a huge tentacle-like appendage shot out from the darkness and grabbed Milo by his leg, squeezing tightly before beginning to pull. Milo screamed and fought, but it was over very quickly, as the unseen monster dragged him into the abyss. My body trembled and tears rolled down my cheeks as I searched in vain for my companions, oddly believing what had just occurred. But then there was a firm hand on my shoulder and a sympathetic word in my ear.
"I'm sorry about your friends, but we need to keep moving."
I nodded my head in painful agreement as the two of us slowly continued our march to an uncertain fate. The remainder of our walk was unnerving, as the ravenous beast closely followed us. But we weren't going to slip up again. Both Marcus and I knew what was at stake now, and we wouldn't fall for their tricks and traps. We trudged along for some time before finally reaching the end of the line, only to see nothing but a dead end, as the white lights abruptly stopped, and there was nothing in front of us except for a dark and empty wasteland. I fell to my knees and felt like crying out in blind fury, but then there was a powerful burst of light before us. I was temporarily blinded by the intense illumination until eventually my eyes adjusted and I observed an extraordinary sight. The darkness of the Shadowlands was now replaced by two portals which sat at the end of the line. On the left was an inviting white light, and to the right stood a swirling vortex of blood red. My jaw dropped, but I was understandably cautious because I had played this game before.
Two portals,
stated Marcus as he walked up beside me.
I guess it's an easy choice for us.
Don't believe it, I replied knowingly. This is a trick.
Not this time,
came the call from the darkness. I recognized the dark man's voice straight away, but I couldn't see him in the shadows. It hardly mattered, however, as the supernatural entity was merely present to deliver his final instructions.
No more tricks, gentlemen. This is the end of the line. Literally, in this case. The portals are exactly what they appear to be. The light leads to a better place, and the vortex to somewhere less pleasant. I'm sorry, gentlemen. You've come so far, and I'd hoped to free you both, but sadly, it's out of my hands. Only one of you can pass into the light. The second must enter the vortex and go to that other place, for a time at least. I can't make this decision for you, gentlemen. You'll need to resolve this yourselves.
And that was it, the dark man's final test. I felt sick to my stomach, hardly believing the situation they'd put us in. I was so sure it would come down to a fight between Marcus and me, a final desperate struggle fought in the mud and darkness. I turned to face the warden whilst expecting the worst, but I was surprised to see a sad resignation on his face, as Marcus smiled faintly whilst placing a firm hand on my shoulder.
You know, Joshua, I've spoken to my wife since I got here. Don't ask me how, but I managed it. I've begged her for forgiveness, but she isn't ready to give it.
He sighed deeply before continuing.
I don't blame her. I guess I still have penance to make. I miss my girls so much, but they've got their mother to look after them, wherever they are. But you have a son, Joshua, and he's all alone. It should be you who walks into the light. I'll find my own way when the time is right.
I was overwhelmed with emotion upon hearing those words and awestruck by Marcus's selfless sacrifice. I don't know what to say.
You don't have to say anything,
was the warden's firm reply.
We'll go together. On 3.
Marcus and I stood side by side, him facing the vortex and me the light. He counted down and we ran forward in unison. The bright light consumed me, pulling me out of the darkness and dropping me somewhere new. As I record my final account, I am sitting on green grass with the sun shining down upon me. I'm surrounded by beauty and life in a pristine and colorful garden. But what brings me the most joy is my son. I watch as Kevin crawls along the soft grass before me, laughing joyfully as he experiences this paradise through the eyes of a child. Kevin is loved and safe, but it pains me that his mother isn't here with us. Perhaps one day, Sally will make her way back to us. But sadly, this is beyond my control. As for me, I don't know whether this is justice or whether I truly deserve this second chance, but I can't dwell on the mistakes of the past as I spend eternity trying to make amends.